On January 13, 1942, a German submarine appeared off the Atlantic coast of the United States. Together with two others, they took up positions near New York City. The group had just completed 2 weeks of travel. Within sight of the Manhattan skyline, the boats went on the attack. The long-range submarines had an easy time of it. U.S. shipping was completely unprepared, assuming that the East Coast was beyond the reach of the Germans. Unprotected, the freighters were at the mercy of torpedoes.
The Germans, after all, had declared war on the U.S. on December 11, 1941. And then the question was how to actually reach the U.S. How could they exert an influence on the U.S.? How could they attack it? The only weapon the Germans had for this were their submarines, and Karl Dönitz, the commander of the submarines, was quite pleased with the opportunity to find new hunting grounds for his submarines. He had rightly assumed that the Americans had peacetime merchant shipping on their east coast, and they were, of course, very easy to attack with submarines. And so he went 5 submarines at first, then more and more to the American east coast and also to the Caribbean. And there hundreds of ships, or about 2 million gross tons, were sunk in the first half of 1942. This was one of the very great successes of the German Navy. Some go so far as to say that this whole Operation Paukenschlag was a second Pearl Harbor.
In einem Einsatzhafen unserer Unterseeboote. Die ersten Amerikafahrer kehren von erfolgreicher Feindfahrt zurück.
Successes like these were most welcome to Nazi propaganda. The newsreels reported extensively on German U-boat heroes.
Kapitänleutnant Hardegen, dessen Boot unmittelbar vor den Toren New Yorks operierte. Kapitänleutnant Hardegen versenkte bisher 110.400 Bruttoregistertonnen, davon 58.000 Bruttoregistertonnen vor New York. Vizeadmiral Dönitz überreicht dem erfolgreichen Kommandanten das Ritterkreuz.
Of course, Nazi propaganda was always looking for images, for stories, for personalizations. We know all this from today's media technology, and in principle, it was no different with Nazi propaganda. What stories can we tell? An infantryman lying in a trench, firing somewhere. That's not a story I can tell. But if I can measure performance, then I can tell stories, then I can award medals. It's like sports. And that's the case with submariners. How much tonnage did they sink? I can measure military performance. That's why submariners are celebrated as heroes by propaganda. I can sell them well. They're young, they're dynamic, they're fighters. They go for it. So I can generate enthusiasm among the youth, unlike the grand mass of the army and the infantry. And the Navy also plays a much bigger role politically through propaganda than it actually plays militarily.
Spielt sie eigentlich auch politisch eine viel größere Rolle, als sie militärisch eigentlich spielt.
On the other side of the continent, America was suddenly threatened by danger from the deep. On February 23rd, a Japanese submarine appeared off the California coast and shelled a refinery near Santa Barbara. For the first time, the U.S. experienced an attack on its mainland. Japan's militaristic government was making propagandistic profit from the foolhardy attack. Ever since the Imperial Navy succeeded in striking a devastating blow against the most important U.S. naval base in the Pacific in December, the Japanese military had been prone to excessive hubris. But exaggerated claims were also being made in the United States.
In the American press after Pearl Harbor, there was actually, of course, exaggerations. But there was definitely this idea that, yes, it's possible that the Yellow Peril is coming. It was possible that the Japanese could also somehow land on the west coast of America. And this fear did exist. As far as the Japanese were concerned, there was never any thought of somehow trying to make a serious landing attempt on the American continent. There were isolated pinpricks on the California coast. That's where the Japanese Navy had sent submarines. But it was more to send the message, if we wanted to, we could reach you. And if we wanted to, we could attack you here. But we're not doing it. It was the same situation with Australia although there were also those in the Japanese military who said, the next step must actually be to take Australia. We have taken all of Southeast Asia. It's not enough that we bomb Darwin in the north of Australia. No, we also have to take Australia, because sooner or later Australia represents the most important base for the Americans in the Asia-Pacific region.
Using the blitzkrieg example of their German ally, Japanese troops had quickly invaded numerous countries in Southeast Asia by December. The Philippines, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore were also under their control by January. As were numerous Pacific islands. Now, the Japanese were preparing to seize other Western European colonies such as Burma and the East Indies. Asia for the Asians was their battle cry, but for many Japanese nationalists, it served as a mere pretext for these campaigns of conquest.
Japan's plan was first to wage a very offensive, lightning-fast war in Southeast Asia to conquer as much territory as possible, as quickly as possible, in the Southeast Asia-Pacific region. Then to hold on to these in a second, more defensive phase, then to consolidate, and then to force the Americans and also Great Britain and the West into a negotiated peace, if possible, on Japanese terms.
The British Crown colony of Hong Kong fell in early December. Japanese forces outnumbered the Empire's colonial troops almost 4-1. They quickly gained air superiority over the city from the Pearl River Delta. Soon, the Allied formations had to retreat. Then, Japanese troops occupied the city. During the so-called Black Christmas, the civilian population endured immeasurable suffering. Arbitrary murders and rapes by the occupiers were the order of the day. Within 4 months, Nippon brought all of Southeast Asia, as well as much of the Pacific Ocean, with about 450 million people under its rule. The Japanese Empire had never been larger. On the other side of the world, people were highly pleased with these developments, even though no one in the Reich Chancellery in Berlin had known about Japan's plans in advance. Shortly after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler awarded a medal to the imperial ambassador.
General Oshima hat hervorragende Verdienste das Zustandekommen des Drei-Mächte-Paktes, der Deutschland, Italien und Japan nun auch zum gemeinsamen Kampf die Neuordnung Europas und des fernöstlichen Raumes zusammenschließt.
Oshima had relatively quickly and relatively well ingratiated himself to Adolf Hitler. As Oshima himself had written and communicated, he also had the feeling that he had quite a good connection to the Nazi regime and to Adolf Hitler himself. Of course, we always have a bit of an idea. There was a kind of global Axis warfare. That is, the Axis powers together created a master plan on how to conquer the world and had coordinated it perfectly. It wasn't like that in reality. Even when we think of the invasion of Poland by the Wehrmacht, it is of course clear that the Japanese army looked very closely at what and how the Wehrmacht acted. From the Japanese side, this first blitzkrieg, which was presented here by the Germans, was studied meticulously and examined at very closely. The Japanese military attaché obtained corresponding reports there and also had them prepared and transmitted to Tokyo. And the Japanese term for blitzkrieg, Dengekisen, was a literal translation.
In order to defeat the enemy together, the U.S. was portrayed by the Axis powers in a grotesquely distorted manner as a politically unstable and bankrupt country. In actual fact, Roosevelt's New Deal had created an enormous economic boom in the States.
Wenn man die Massen hungernder Untertanen der Roosevelt-Plutokratie sieht, dann begreift man die Furcht der amerikanisch-jüdischen Ausbeuterklicke und ihrer politischen Handlanger vor einem Erwachen dieser Millionen. So geht es den kleinen Arbeitern und Bauern in diesem freien Lande. Im nationalsozialistischen Deutschland sind derartige Verhältnisse undenkbar. Deswegen ist das Ziel der jüdischen Kapitalisten und ihres Roosevelt die Vernichtung Deutschlands. Sie verstecken sich dabei hinter Phrasen und Schlagworten wie Freiheit, Demokratie und menschliche Kultur die angeblich alle durch Nazi-Deutschland gefährdet seien.
The pictures of the global economic crisis, taken 10 years earlier, were intended to show the supposed state of the nation. Not only was the population led to believe that the American economy was in the doldrums, the Nazi leadership apparently believed this as well.
One of the crucial questions, after all, is why Hitler declared war on the US on December 11, 1941. And it seems that there was something about Hitler's perception at that time in December of 1941, because he believed that the US could not sustain a long war, even economically. On the whole, of course, from today's vantage point, one could make the case that Hitler and many others, the German leadership, the German intelligence service and others massively underestimated the economic power of the United States. There were voices, but only a few, who said that if we go to war with the US, then we can no longer win the war. There were those people. There were also military officers, Fritz Todt, for example, as former Minister of Armaments, who was very critical in the fall of 1941, who said, if the US enters the war, then we have no chance there economically. But most of Hitler's advisors massively underestimated this.
The German arms industry was in full swing. Nazi propaganda euphorically hyped the war-related boom as an armaments miracle. The upswing was initiated by Fritz Todt, the Minister of Armaments. However, when Todt became critical of the course of the war, a rift with Hitler ensued. On February 8, 1942, the civil engineer was killed in a plane crash at the Rastenburg airport near the Führer's headquarters, Wolfschanz. Hitler ordered a state funeral and posthumously awarded Todt the highest honor of the National Socialist Reich, the Teutonic Order. A few hours after Todt's death, Adolf Hitler appointed his favorite architect as his successor.
Albert Speer was a gifted manager, and above all, he had the advantage of having direct access to Hitler. He was able to achieve things organizationally that Fritz Todt had also conceived, but also always wanted, had also set on the right path, but only Speer could achieve that. His relationship with Hitler was a very special one. So he got the recognition, became armaments minister with a spectrum of control that Todt had never dreamed of. And he was capable in organizing armaments. But this armaments miracle that many talked about had not really been a miracle, but was a very normal process of switching from a peacetime economy to a wartime economy.
Albert Speer succeeded in increasing production output in some areas of armaments. He also knew how to market himself and his successes effectively for propaganda purposes. In fact, German armaments lagged far behind the achievements of the Allied armaments manufacturers, a fact that Hitler also studiously ignored.
The most important first measures that Speer took during his first weeks were above all displays of staging and propaganda. So now he had the so-called home front propaganda, which systematically referred to the production miracles and the achievements of the German armaments industry, and which then very soon became intoxicated with its own successes.
In einer großen Waffenschmiede des Reiches sprach der Führer zu allen deutschen Rüstungsarbeitern. Die Gefolgschaft des Werkes versammelte sich in einer riesigen Montagehalle, in der aus mächtigen Stahl- und Eisenblöcken eine Rednertribüne aufgebaut war.
In view of these supposed successes, even the majority of the traditionally left-wing working class agreed with the regime.
Lange Zeit hat man angenommen, for a long time, it was assumed that the workers' movement, especially in the cities where there was a high proportion of workers, actually had a particularly high level of resistance to the Nazis. Obviously, that's not what we think today anymore. The fact is that the Nazi dictatorship was a dictatorship of consent, a consensus dictatorship. There was certainly resistance, but that was clearly a smaller part of the civilian population. And there was a high level of willingness, especially because many who had actually lived in economically difficult circumstances in the 1920s or at the beginning of the 1930s were subjectively better off and actually benefited from the racist system.
auch tatsächlich profitierten davon.
And it was not just through rearmament and through the boosting of arms production, but also overall, at least for a segment of the population, there were better economic conditions, and thereby the approval also rose.
Und dadurch die Zustimmung auch stieg.
As the war progressed, more and more workers, which Speer needed, were sent to the front. On Hitler's behalf, Fritz Sauckel planned the importation of millions of forced laborers to the Reich for use in the armaments industry and agriculture. First of all, volunteers were recruited, za granica, or abroad. The Polish workers and agricultural laborers were promised land, or that's what German propaganda promised. There was no discussion of endless shifts in dangerous production factories in the armaments industry, but of work in Volkswagen factories, including rations and full pay packets. In truth, they were fed and paid less than German workers. If any of these so-called foreign or Eastern workers objected, they were threatened with imprisonment in a concentration camp.
Am Anfang gab es ja durchaus auch den Versuch,
In the beginning, there was an attempt to find volunteer workers and bring them to Germany. They realized very quickly that this would in no way bring the masses that were needed. In this respect, they very quickly turned to coercive measures through work obligations, but also through so-called forcible recruitment. That is, people were simply taken off the streets in the occupied areas, out of restaurants, out of cinemas, out of houses, by force.
Children were regarded as useless mouths to feed. Even babies born in Germany to so-called Eastern workers were deliberately left to starve. The Germans subjected up to 11 million people to forced labor. In no other National Socialist crime were so many involved as victims, perpetrators, or spectators. Speer operated his industries with forced laborers from concentration camps until the end of the war.
For Speer, the forced laborers were war material. That is, it was a matter of getting as many able-bodied people as possible into war production. And indeed, the more the war progressed, and the more difficult, in practical terms, the requirement was to supply this war material, the more brutal the recruiting measures became.
Forced laborers used in agriculture often came from Poland. They were strictly forbidden to associate with German women. Anyone who did was denounced and, at the least, faced public humiliation.
The whole thing was organized. It was not spontaneous anger that broke out, but these women were usually denounced. And if these women were convicted, it could lead to prison sentences, or mostly to concentration camp sentences. And these sentences were usually accompanied by public humiliation, which was clearly intended to really affect the social dignity of the women. For example, by cutting their hair off completely, putting a sign on them, taking pictures with them, leading them through the whole village. Sometimes there were also violent attacks, but it was all organized. For example, the BDM, the National Socialist Women's Society, was involved. It was not something that sprang spontaneously from the population.
Until March of 1942, the Hanseatic city of Lübeck had been largely spared the direct effects of the war. Unlike the Reich capital Berlin, no Allied bombs had fallen there yet. The medieval alleys of the old town still stood untouched, despite the nearby submarine shipyard at Travemünde Harbor and its relatively good accessibility for the Royal Air Force flying units. Up until February 1942, they had been subjected to the so-called Area Bombing Directive. The aim of the attacks were to break the morale of the German civilian population by any means, especially that of the industrial workers. the new commander-in-chief, Arthur Harris, was explicitly told that the targets were to be built-up areas and not, for example, shipyards or aircraft factories. On the starry moonlit night of March 29th, the British dropped their deadly load over Lübeck. After the area bombardment, Thomas Mann's birthplace was in flames. The exile had no knowledge of the new directive.
Beim jüngsten britischen Raid über Hitlerland hat das alte Lübeck zu leiden gehabt. Das geht mich an. Es ist meine Vaterstadt. Die Angriffe galten dem Hafen von Travemünde, den kriegsindustriellen Anlagen dort. Aber es hat Brände gegeben in der Stadt. Aber ich denke an Coventry und habe nichts einzuwenden gegen die Lehre, dass alles bezahlt werden muss.
320 people were killed in the firestorm. But contrary to Thomas Mann's suspicions, the attacks were not motivated by a desire for retribution, but were calculated. The next area bombardment was to be Rostock.
Why Lübeck and Rostock in particular? Both were Hanseatic cities that had an easily combustible inner city core, and they were located by the sea and were therefore easy to find. The interesting thing, Lübeck was also a military target. Submarines were built in Lübeck in the Flander factories. But they didn't attack the Flander factories, they attacked the medieval old town. And it was the same in Rostock and other cities later. The plan was to attack about 50 German cities, burn them down and kill about 900,000 civilians. This was done to cause chaos in Germany, because the British argument was that no state would exist without its cities. These were administrative centers, economic centers. When the population fled from the cities, when there were no more administrative centers, there would be chaos. And then the Germans would start a revolution, an uprising, like they did in 1918.
But this did not happen. On the contrary, the population showed solidarity with the Nazi regime, which immediately provided aid. The National Socialist People's Welfare Organization provided free accommodation and food.
Dass dieser Effekt nicht eingetreten
The fact that this effect did not occur, that the bombing didn't lower the morale of the civilian population so that it could possibly lead to an uprising,
ich glaube, das ist eine
I think that was a great misjudgment on the part of the British Army.
Der britischen Armee gewesen, denn die meisten
Because most of the German
Zivilisten
civilians
haben
accepted
das
their situation,
hingenommen,
because they believed that it was their
weil
duty.
sie glaubten,
It was
dass
their
das für
contribution,
sie, dass es
what
ihre
they had
Pflicht
to
ist, dass
endure in
das
this
ihr
war.
sozusagen Beitrag ist, was sie
They
in diesem
compared
Krieg
themselves to
aushalten
soldiers
müssen,
who had to
im
endure the
Vergleich
same at
zu
the
den
fronts.
Soldaten, was die praktisch dann an den Fronten aushalten müssen. Und da ist
And
etwas,
this Volksgemeinschaft
ja,
understood
diese
itself as a
Volksgemeinschaft hat sich
community at
eben
war,
als eine
as a wartime
Gemeinschaft im
society.
Krieg verstanden, als eine Kriegsgesellschaft.
U.S. bomber squadrons also flew attacks on Nazi Germany from the United Kingdom. With their flying fortresses, from summer 1942 onward, they attacked mainly during the day, primarily industrial targets and infrastructure. A Boeing B-17 is capable of carrying more than 4,000 kilograms of bombs. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill did express reservations about his own strategy, but didn't change it.
Once they started with their bombing directive, they didn't divert from that, because that would have meant questioning what you had done in the years before. So they collected intelligence that confirmed the strategy and left out other intelligence. So the classic case of intelligence failure or politically directed intelligence work that always confirmed only what they wanted to hear. And so British intelligence services reported that next fall, next spring, the Germans would collapse. So this began in February 1942, that the Bomber Command, the attacks almost completely concentrated on attacking the German inner cities and burning them down, attacking especially the neighborhoods where the German industrial workers lived, who they wanted to hit, and they wanted to kill in order to cause chaos. And in turn to hit the industrial production in order to end the war with that.
One of the favorite targets of the British bomber squadrons was Cologne. Because of its geographical location, it was relatively easy to reach. Camera crews of the Ministry of Propaganda made films about the heavily hit city center after the so-called 1,000-bomber raid on the night of May 31st. The face of the cathedral city had been changed overnight. Almost 500 people died and 45,000 were homeless.
That's also what's special about the bombing directive that was issued there in February of 1942, because it changed the target, changed the intent. It wasn't, if we kill civilians, they just die, but civilians then became the main target. And that's what made that directive in February 1942 so special.
Meanwhile, at Obersalzberg in the Bavarian Alps, Adolf Hitler and his entourage were safe from such attacks in the Berghof. Italy's Duce, Benito Mussolini, arrived for a visit at the end of April. For the newsreels, the two dictators demonstrated unity and strength. To regain the lost initiative in the war against the Soviet Union, Hitler had planned a summer offensive. Units of his ally also fought on the Eastern Front.
In der südlichen Ukraine. Italienische Verbände greifen ein von den Sowjets hartnäckig verteidigtes Dorf an.
In the previous year, the Axis attacks had stalled at the fronts of Leningrad, Moscow, and Sevastopol. Then, Army Group South, supported by Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian units, was to go on the offensive again. Since October 1941, the Third Army, supported by Hungarian troops, had been besieging the Crimean city of Sevastopol. Only at the end of June 1942, after heavy fighting, did the defeat of the Soviet defenders become apparent. The way to the south was free. Then, the German advance was directed towards the Caucasus. From Kharkov, the troops were to advance in the direction of Baku. Hitler had long since decided to exploit the Soviet Union along colonial lines, as one memorandum put it. But the circumstances were unfavorable. The bloodied Wehrmacht could no longer operate with three army groups as it had the year before. It was only capable of advancing in a single direction.
When the Germans began their summer offensive in 1942, the target was the Caucasus and the Soviet oil. And this goal made sense because 90% of Soviet oil was in the Caucasus. If they conquered that, they would have had access to it themselves, and most importantly, they would cut off the Soviets from it. There was relatively little oil in the Urals, so that would have been a real armament blow to the Soviet Union.
In May, the Germans had repulsed the Soviet offensive near Kharkov and occupied the city. An officer documented the everyday life of the occupation in the eastern Ukrainian metropolis. The Germans then had an opportunity to systematically put their criminal plans into practice. Numerous inhabitants of the city had already been deported to Germany for forced labor. Then the deportations to the death camps began.
Beginning in June of 1941, with the start of the war against the Soviet Union, they already had in advance the criminal orders, that is, those orders that were agreed on between the Reich government, the Nazi government, and the military leadership. So there was already a clear option. And corresponding orders were also issued, that this war would be a special war, a world war, a war of extermination, for which certain regulations of international law, which were supposed to limit the war and its dynamics of violence, were suspended. And there was a difference between the Wehrmacht advancing forward and an occupation regime in the various sub-areas, which is, after all, a military occupation in the beginning. And then later on it turned into a civil administration, through which also the persecution of political opponents, but also of the Jewish population, actually ran more administratively.
The victory at Kharkov was one of the last successful encirclement battles fought by the Germans. The forces earmarked for the Soviet Spring Offensive were annihilated. Some 240,000 Soviet soldiers went into captivity and to a horrible fate.
Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers died in the Nazi camps. and you can say that these people were systematically killed by hunger. You can't say that that was a result of malnutrition or lack of supplies, but rather that those prisoners of war were deliberately and intentionally driven to their deaths. Numerous prisoners of war were in Auschwitz and were killed there, and the first experiments of using gas to kill people were made using Soviet prisoners of war. And word got around in the Red Army. That's why the number of defectors and prisoners of war decreased, because word got out about how Red Army soldiers were treated in Germany. That's when the chance of survival ended up being greater in Red Army units than in German camps.
In the spring of 1942, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels visited one such POW camp. The agitator knew how to use the desperate situation of the Soviet Union, invaded by the Germans, for his perfidious propaganda and portrayed the defeated as subhumans. He no longer had any great illusions about the course of the war.
Goebbels was the most realistic of all of them. For him it was pretty clear that the matter was over, that they weren't going to win anymore, but that they had a great chance to implement their murderous program now, because they all had to participate. You could also say that from 1942 on, the regime had no interest in anything else than to implement this great program of extermination. To accomplish this, any means were acceptable.
The main executors of the regime's extermination plans were Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich. Since the beginning of the war, they had already murdered tens of thousands, mainly by shooting. That was when the mass crimes were systematized with German thoroughness. The civil servants appointed by the regime to administer the killing met in a villa on Wannsee in January to lay down the justification for it, the so-called Wannsee Protocol. It was recorded how many people one intended to kill, 11 million.
The decision that European Jews should be completely and systematically murdered had been made at that time. And in this respect, it was the task of this institution, within the framework of its competence to act, to implement this. And this was practically the translation of this ideological political will into an administrative challenge. Also discussed was the question of the deportation of German and Western European Jews to the ghettos and to the camps in the East. All that was the subject of this conference.
The so-called final solution of the Jewish question, as it was called in the jargon of the National Socialists, had become a concrete program. The plan for the genocide of the Jews stipulated how many people should be deported, in what period of time, and by what means they were to be killed. The Auschwitz concentration camp in occupied Poland was now expanded to become the largest Nazi death camp. SS Chief Himmler personally saw to the expansion of these camps. The killing factories were to relieve the overcrowded ghettos and camps where epidemics and starvation were rampant. The regime wanted to bring the killing of the undesirables back under its control.
The pressure came from the ghettos and the camps. The pressure came from those responsible. They could no longer continue to operate this way. This, of course, created a compulsion to act, in their logic at least. And from that, we now understand that this very search for more efficient killing methods very quickly came to putting this effective killing machinery in motion, with Zyklon B in the gas chambers.
The name Auschwitz became a worldwide symbol of Nazi terror and genocide. By the end of the war, an estimated 1.5 million people had died in Auschwitz from gas, hunger, and disease. Meanwhile, Goebbels exhorted the Germans on the home front, warning anyone who was a thorn in the side of the Nazi dictatorship, be it the Soviet population, Jews, opponents of the regime, or even dissidents. There was hardly any opposition. Fear of Gestapo terror and imprisonment silenced many critics of the war. In May of 1942, a propaganda exhibition, the Soviet Paradise, opened in Berlin with a staged mass spectacle. The film, produced especially for the show, mocked the Russian population that had been impoverished by war and destruction.
Mit dem siegreichen Vormarsch unserer Truppen konnten Kriegsberichter tief beeindruckt vom Sowjetparadies, das ihnen nun in seinem hoffnungslosen und grauen Alltag offen lag, ausschnittartig aufnehmen, was sie während der Fahrtpausen sahen.
Not everyone believed the grotesque phrases. Nevertheless, the propaganda of hate was having an effect.
Man sieht schon auch
One could already see, for example, in letters from the field, that propaganda was often believed by what the letter writers themselves had already accepted as stereotypical images of the enemy. Then, very often, they also believed what the propaganda represented. As far as the Soviet Union was concerned, it must be said that many soldiers who participated in the war, especially during the invasion after June 1941, believed the stereotypes that existed in German propaganda, namely that they were subhumans, and that there was a high degree of willingness to reproduce these images. There we can also see how the integration into the declared goals of the war of extermination, that we were dealing with a war that from the very beginning aimed not only to win militarily, but to actually radically destroy this enemy.
Sondern diesen Feind tatsächlich radikal zu vernichten.
Das ist unser Vorsprung. Die unnachahmbare Haltung deutscher Soldaten, ihre Kühnheit, ihr Angriffsgeist, ihre Zuverlässigkeit. Diesen deutschen Soldaten geht in vorbildlichem Führertum der deutsche Offizier voran, als Träger der Waffenausbildung und der Kampfmoral und als Garant unseres Vorsprungs, den kein Feindstaat mehr einholen kann, des sieghaften Geistes deutschen Soldatentums.
Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the fortunes of war initially seemed to be on the side of the Japanese. The U.S. base in the Philippines was now the focus of the Japanese Empire. Since the turn of the century, the United States had had a naval base in the archipelago. There were numerous bomber squadrons stationed there, but technically obsolete. Some of the weapons technology also dated back to the First World War. The exiled Americans led a colonial-style life in the Philippines and did not seem to expect an attack until Japanese troops attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. One day after the raid, Japan attacked the Philippines. The capital, Manila, had fallen on January 2, 1942. During the occupation, Japanese troops committed horrific atrocities against the civilian population in a city that was almost completely destroyed. The U.S. troops retreated to the Bataan Peninsula. In April, they surrendered. About 60,000 American soldiers became Japanese prisoners of war.
The Japanese military committed a great number of war crimes during World War II, and one of the main victim groups were white Anglo-Americans, as were Australian soldiers, prisoners of war, who were considered inferior by the Japanese soldiers because of racial views.
Aufgrund von rassistischen und rassischen Anschauungen als minderwertig betrachtet wurden.
The prisoners had to march more than 100 kilometers in the blazing sun. Their destination was a railroad station from which they were transported to a prisoner of war camp.
On the Japanese side, these soldiers were not provided for at all. There was almost no food, nothing to drink, or only insufficient. And in addition, these soldiers were also physically maltreated, were beaten, were chastised. Some were also shot, or if someone lay down at the roadside because he could not march on, then he was simply beaten to death on the spot or shot. Out of 60,000 soldiers, more than 10,000 certainly died in the Bataan Death March. After all, these soldiers all ended up in Japanese captivity, continued to be mistreated in captivity for weeks, months, years. And of those soldiers embarked on the Bataan Death March, only 15,000 returned home when the war ended.
Nach dem Ende des Krieges nur noch 15.000 in die Heimat zurückgekehrt.
In April, an aircraft carrier with a squadron of bombers on board set out from the United States for the Pacific. President Roosevelt did everything he could to stop the Japanese advance. A surprise military strike was planned to put the empire in its place.
It happened in the spring of 1942, the so-called Doolittle raids. That was an air raid on Japan's capital, Tokyo. It was intended to send a clear message to the Japanese army. You are now in danger. We are now going on the offensive, and we are in a position not only to somehow attack a peripheral part of the Japanese empire, but we are in a position to strike at the heart of Japan, to go all the way to the seat of the Japanese emperor and bomb Tokyo.
Mobilization against Japan was also taking place on the home front. Racism fomented by the propaganda broke through unchecked. Since Pearl Harbor, all U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry were considered a security risk. Far away from civilization, the first internment camps were built on American soil. They consisted of barren barracks and were guarded by U.S. soldiers.
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans, including people who had American passports, were transferred to relocation camps, not only in the United States but also in Canada. And in a way, it was a continuation of an anti-Japanese, anti-Asian policy that had been pursued in the US even before the Second World War. That must not be forgotten. This also showed, in a certain respect, this racist way of thinking, which was also definitely present on the part of the Americans. In addition, of course, there was a certain idea that people were saying, you have to lock these people up now, because they could be used by the Japanese side as informers. They could somehow spy around. They could somehow infiltrate American society. They presented a danger.
120,000 men, women, and children were sent to those camps. Enemy alien was their official title. Those who refused went to prison for years.
Interestingly enough, in the relocation camps, Japanese Americans really fought for recognition by saying, we want to go to war on the American side too. For a long time, the American side did not allow this. Roosevelt had no interest in it for a long time.
In 1944, the internments were declared unconstitutional. The victims, however, had to wait almost 50 years for an apology. Midway Island in the Central Pacific was home to the farthest western outpost of the United States. The U.S. Navy Air Base was located right in the middle of the Pacific Ocean between Japan and California. The 6-square-kilometer atoll consisted mainly of 3 runways. To wage war across the Pacific against Japan, aircraft carriers and their bomber squadrons played the most important role. Each existing airfield represented an important strategic advantage.
In the spring of 1942, American forces were increasingly trying to go on the offensive in the Asia-Pacific region, to now take the initiative, to take the scepter, so to say, militarily out of Japan's hands. And the Japanese, on the other hand, were toying with the idea of not only further consolidating the conquered territories there, but possibly making up for the missed landing in Hawaii after all.
Unlike the attack on Pearl Harbor, this time the Americans were prepared. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese fighter squadrons attacked Midway. They bombarded the 2 islands for 20 minutes. But the Americans were expecting the Japanese fleet. They had cracked the Japanese radio codes and thus identified the target of the attack in advance. The commanders had assembled as many aircraft carriers as possible at Midway.
At the Battle of Midway, the Japanese Navy lost 4 of 6 aircraft carriers. You have to remember that the American war effort had a lot more battleships and many more aircraft carriers in the pipeline compared to Japan. Japan couldn't keep up in any way with the US armor-wise. And that's why the Battle of Midway represented a turning point in the Pacific War.
Einen Wendepunkt im Pazifikkrieg dar.
The Japanese suffered heavy losses. More than 3,000 Japanese soldiers died in that battle.
There was also the aspect of not only aircraft carriers being lost in the Battle of Midway, perhaps more importantly for the Japanese Empire, the very well-trained Japanese pilots who had war experience, who had also been on the attack on Pearl Harbor. Many of those pilots were killed there.
The Battle of Midway was a successful payback for Pearl Harbor. The Japanese advance had been halted. Nevertheless, it was clear that the soldiers still had a long, blood-soaked road ahead of them to Tokyo. At that point, however, no one suspected the final extent to which the slaughter would go. The dying in the Pacific would continue for 3 more years and cost the lives of tens of thousands of GIs. In the early summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht launched a new offensive in the Soviet Union. From Kharkov in Ukraine, a German assault force began its advance eastward. As in the year before, the troops advanced deep into the country, but the appearance of rapid success was deceptive. The width of the front line on which the units had to operate increased 2.5 times, with troop strength decreasing daily. Fall Blau, the operation's code name, demanded the utmost from the soldiers. They had to advance as far as the Caucasian oil fields on the Caspian Sea and cross the Don River in the process.
In 1941, the first major campaign had just failed. It had not succeeded strategically, it had not achieved its operational goals. And now suddenly something happened that Hitler had not reckoned with, that he certainly didn't want. The war had not only become a world war, but it was dragging on. They knew. They had to plan for years now. It was not enough to say the war will last until October 1941. Suddenly, it was unforeseeable how long the war would last. And that's why it became a matter of economic areas, of strategic resources which Hitler believed you had to have in order to be able to continue the war for a longer period of time.
The initial weak resistance of the Red Army caused the commander-in-chief to make a fatal decision, to the horror of his generals. Hitler split the already strained Army Group South into 2 parts. While Army Group A continued to advance toward the Caucasus, Army Group B was to secure the northern flank along the Volga.
Hitler believed, however, that once the offensive was underway, the Russians would be defeated. They would run away and Russia would collapse. And so he split the direction of the attacks. And now it included Stalingrad and the Caucasus as targets. Army Group South was split up, and that massively overextended the German forces. That was an operational error of the First Order on the part of Hitler.
Although all the generals predicted a disaster for him, the dictator insisted on the need for the operation. In August, he met a high-ranking visitor at his headquarters. Hitler wanted to persuade his ally, Tsar Boris of Bulgaria, to enter the war against the Soviet Union. The Führer urgently needed support for his latest plan. The most important goal of the war was no longer the conquest of living space, but oil. "If I don't get the oil from Maikop and Grozny," said the dictator, "then I will have to liquidate this war." But the Tsar refused.
The Bulgarians traditionally had a very close relationship with Russia. There was the religious connection, there was the cultural connection, and that's why Tsar Boris III said he would take part in the German war, but not against the Soviet Union. Also at that time, the Bulgarians were an important occupying power in Yugoslavia. They also sent troops there, they fought there. They also fought in Greece, but they were the only ally not fighting against the Soviet Union.
Hitler vastly underestimated the Red Army's striking power. He assumed that the enemy had largely used up the mass of his reserves in the first winter of the war. The Russians, said the dictator, were at the end of their strength, but the opposite was the case. Georgy Zhukov, a competent strategist, became Stalin's deputy commander-in-chief in August. The Red Army was now also training partisan units. They were supposed to sabotage the invading Germans behind the front. Thanks to Allied arms deliveries, the quality of the equipment, as well as the training of the soldiers, constantly improved. The fighting strength of the Soviet units increased. It was evident for the first time in Stalingrad.
Stalingrad was of enormous geostrategic importance. It was located on the Volga, and the Volga was the lifeline of the Soviet Union. The oil came from the Caucasus, had been transported across the Caspian Sea to the center of the Soviet Union via the Volga. At the time, Stalingrad itself was a city of heavy industry and important weapons factories. That's why Stalingrad came into the operation planning. In the first drafts of Operation Blue, it said, you just have to eliminate Stalingrad, somehow stop the traffic of the Volga. Eliminate it. This was actually achieved in August 1942, when they reached the Volga just north of Stalingrad. And then it became more and more important. It had a symbolic value. It was simply Stalin's city, and then the meaning actually changed. It was no longer about an economic geostrategic meaning, but about conquering the city as a symbolic political act. Because they had not conquered other symbolic cities, they had not conquered Leningrad, they had not conquered Moscow, so now, so to speak, this symbol of victory over Stalin with the conquest of his city had to happen.
Hitler pulled together all his remaining forces to achieve this goal. In the meantime, German tanks were running out of fuel in their hunt for oil in the steppe region of the Don. Smaller units had reached the oil wells of Maikop, but not enough for the urgently needed supplies. Frustration often resulted in outbreaks of violence. On their way, the troops left behind a trail of devastation. In this modern war, more civilians died than soldiers.
Soldiers had endured wading in the blood of the front line for many years. And the special phenomenon was, we talk a lot about post-traumatic stress disorders nowadays with the missions abroad. Of course, an incredible number of soldiers of the Wehrmacht had post-traumatic stress disorders without this finding. But most of them had obviously developed incredible resilience. The actual thing that needed to be explained was not that people were traumatized in a medical sense. They were traumatized soldiers. They were in the minority. The majority built resilience and were able to live with dying, killing and fighting, at least to the point where they could live a reasonably normal life again afterwards.
Dass sie danach wieder ein halbwegs normales Leben führen konnten.
The carnage was successfully suppressed. The downside of the war was played down for the Volksgemeinschaft. Here, we see how the war-wounded and frontline fighters are cared for in Munich's English Garden. The Nazis knew very well the psyche of their people, wrote a judicial official Friedrich Kellner in his diary in the summer of 1942. Confidence in victory only lasts when victory follows victory, assuming that the end of the war is in sight. The people don't care how that is achieved.
The point of cabaret evenings, Wehrmacht film screenings in particular, was to give soldiers opportunities to stop thinking about the war, to dream about a different future and to think about the time before the war again.
In fact, since the beginning of the campaign against the Soviet Union, every third German soldier had been reported wounded, missing, or dead. Unmoved by this, the Nazi leadership in Munich staged a parade of troops on a grand scale. The regime knew how to stir up public opinion. Nazi Germany was still only receiving reports of success from the front. Being possibly defeated by the Bolshevik enemy seemed unthinkable. People were confident of victory.
On the one hand, morale in Nazi Germany was high for a long time because people were still relatively well off. On the other hand, there was definitely great ideological fervor in the population. People believed in the final victory. They believed in the Führer. They believed in the goals of the war. A certain well-being plus a belief in the goals kept the population united for a very long time. Plus, any kind of resistance was brutally punished, suppressed. There was no free media, no critical reporting, so it was difficult to form an opinion about what the real situation was. Perhaps one was aware of one's immediate surroundings, and even the news coming from the field was all censored. There was definitely great ignorance among the population about how bad things really were.
Hitler had given the order to Colonel General Friedrich Paulus to conquer Stalingrad. The Sixth Army was advancing on the city. Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians had to secure the flanks. On the way to the Volga, they soon experienced acute supply shortages. The condition of many of the divisions were already critical and visibly deteriorating. More than 1 million Wehrmacht soldiers had already been reported killed, wounded, or missing in action. Exhaustion was spreading. The march of more than 1,000 kilometers had left the men at the edge of their endurance. They had no idea what lay ahead of them.
Research has shown that the Germans were already completely weakened when they faced Stalingrad, that they were at the end of their tether, that the units had already been bled dry, that they had supply problems. They had started to starve even before the city was closed in, while the Soviet Union was able to deploy massive reserves there, and the Foreign Army's East Department completely misjudged that.
On August 23, 1942, Luftflotte 4, Air Force 4 under General Oberst von Richthofen began bombing the city. 600 bombers dropped explosive and incendiary bombs for days in 1,600 sorties. 40,000 civilians died. All that remained of Stalingrad was a field of rubble. On September 3rd, the first German units reached the outer ring of defense.
And then the Red Army dragged the Germans into a house-to-house battle that involved extremely heavy losses. And now, on top of that, the Red Army was fighting a battle at no matter what the cost. The fact that they outnumbered the Germans, that they constantly counterattacked, had huge losses, and even though the Germans were outnumbered, they managed to capture the city. And although the attackers were superior, the toll in blood was immense. For Stalin, it was also about symbolism. My city must not be captured. To put it bluntly, Stalin was smothering the German advance in the blood of his own soldiers.
Stalin erstickt den deutschen Vormarsch im Blut der eigenen Soldaten.
In accordance with Stalin's orders of don't take a step back, Red Army soldiers who were accused of lacking combat readiness were put in front of a firing squad. Stalin expressly forbade the evacuation of civilians from the city.
The Soviet Union would have had to pay a much smaller toll in blood had it not been for the decision made by this dictator. Until 1942, all of his decisions were wrong. He forbid soldiers to retreat. He ordered units that had no ammunition at all and could not continue fighting to continue fighting. He had had dozens of generals shot for failure. He basically ruled everywhere with fear and terror and believed that a frontal assault was the only way to win a war. Not to mention that he was influenced by very archaic ideas of honor and masculinity. All of this made no military sense at all, and he only listened to his generals now and then after the Battle of Stalingrad. The idea that people today associate Stalin as the dictator who was the great strategist of the Second World War is completely wrong. People associate his name with victory in World War II, but without him, there would have been a greater chance of ending this war sooner.
Aber ohne ihn wäre die Chance, den Krieg eher zu beenden, größer gewesen.
Stalin ordered the 62nd Army to defend the city unconditionally. 200,000 civilians had to build defenses and barricades in work columns. Nevertheless, the Germans succeeded in pushing the Russians back to the banks of the Volga. Soon, they had conquered about 90% of the city. In the course of the battle, 500,000 Soviet soldiers died in a hail of bullets. The NKVD executed another 13,500 Red Army soldiers for alleged desertion.
What Stalin was displaying there was complete contempt for his own people, and the generals as well. Maybe not all of them, but many generals really had no regard for casualties at all. It was only crucial that in the end someone was left holding the flag high, and that this could be counted as a victory. It's pretty dramatic what happened there, how people were sometimes sent into the fire and were burned. The Germans noted with shaking heads in their field reports that at points where there were already masses of dead or destroyed tanks, even there the generals sent their troops into the fire again and again. So you have to say that with many Soviet military leaders, there was a complete contempt for the life of their own soldiers.
At Hitler's refuge at Obersalzberg in the summer of 1942, reports of successes from North Africa were also coming in. At the Berghof, the dictator welcomed his ally, Benito Mussolini. A year earlier, the latter's disastrous conduct of the war had prompted Hitler to send German troop units to North Africa. After alternating offensives on both sides, the operations of the Axis powers against the Allies were extremely successful. The goal of Operation Theseus was the conquest of the Libyan fortress of Tobruk, an important port in the Mediterranean. Hitler's favorite general, Erwin Rommel, had been able to achieve surprising success time and again since the beginning of the North African campaign. The vast desert plains enabled his armored troops to conduct long-range operations in a fast-moving war, and then Rommel set out to conquer Egypt.
In May of 1942, Rommel's tank army was properly supplied for the first time. Sufficient supplies had arrived via the Mediterranean, and Rommel decided to launch a major offensive. He bypassed the British positions at Gazala, took Tobruk by storm, something he had not been able to do a year earlier, and advanced across the Egyptian border to El Alamein, 80 kilometers from Alexandria.
Und dringt über die ägyptische Grenze bis nach El Alamein, 80 Kilometer vor Alexandria vor.
The deep-water port of Tobruk secured supplies for the German troops across Libya. The victory had cost the Afrika Korps heavy losses. Its inventory of tanks was severely depleted. Next, Hitler wanted the Wehrmacht units to occupy the Suez Canal. Rommel's top commander was already planning to advance from there further into the Near East and India to gain access to the British colonies.
Britain's entire position in Middle East actually hinged on the defense of Cairo and the important port of Alexandria. And surprisingly, Rommel had just managed to conquer Tobruk in the summer of 1942, and then very surprisingly continued to invade Egypt. And then the big question was, would he, in a final effort, manage to get to Cairo as well?
Die große Frage, wird es schaffen, einem letzten Anstrengung nach Kairo zu kommen?
Just one day after winning the Battle of Tobruk on June 21st, Rommel was promoted to Field Marshal General. At the age of 50, he became the youngest to hold this rank.
Auf dem Flugplatz des Führerhauptquartiers. Generaloberst Rommel trifft aus Afrika ein.
The newsreel propaganda knew how to seize the moment.
Der Sieger von Nordafrika sprach auf Einladung von Reichsminister Dr. Goebbels vor Vertretern der in- und ausländischen Presse über die Ereignisse auf dem nordafrikanischen Kriegsschauplatz. Der Marschall erklärte unter anderem: Dank der Tapferkeit unserer Soldaten sind wir in einem harten Ringen mit dem Engländer fertig geworden, obwohl unsere militärische Kraft ihm zahlenmäßig oft unterlegen war.
Es folgten harte Kämpfe am Ras Madauer, vor allem im Mai, die beinahe mit Kampfverhältnissen vor Verdun zu vergleichen sind. Aber der deutsche Soldat und neben ihm auch die italienischen Kameraden haben diese schwierigen Zeiten überstanden, haben jeden Versuch, die Festung Tobruk zu entsetzen, abgewehrt.
Marschall Rommel meldet sich beim Führer und empfängt aus seiner Hand den Marschallstab.
In July, Rommel wanted to finally win the African campaign and ordered the armored units to continue their rapid advance. But the Allies prevented them from circumventing their positions again and met the German troops at the decisive battle at El Alamein.
The British set up defensive positions at El Alamein, and that was very well chosen because to the south was the Qattara Depression, where the Germans couldn't deploy their armored forces. Thus, in early July, the British succeeded in thwarting Rommel's breakthrough attempt at the First Battle of El Alamein.
After the rapid advance, the tank army's supplies and fuel were largely depleted, and the supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the soldiers were exhausted. Rommel knew that he had to be able to penetrate the Allied defenses in one swift thrust and prevent retreat.
Ende August entschließt sich Rommel ein letztes
At the end of August, Rommel decided to attack one last time in order to perhaps reach Alexandria, the Nile, and the Suez. He attacked, but after 48 hours his offensive had more or less failed. The British had managed to bring in enough reinforcements.
Verstärkungen heranzuführen.
In the meantime, their air force had gained supremacy over the German air force, and so Rommel then had to retreat once again to his initial position.
At the beginning of November, the Field Marshal had to admit that he had lost the second battle for El Alamein. When he learned of Rommel's order to retreat, Hitler was beside himself. You can show your troops only one way, either victory or death, was the Führer's radio message. But the Field Marshal had the radio traffic cut off during the retreat. A warrant for Rommel's arrest was not enforced. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner of war by the Allies. To mark the victory, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrived for a troop visit at the British 8th Army and was celebrated.
El Alamein
El Alamein was the first great victory for the British. They had really beaten Rommel decisively this time. It was not victory in North Africa, but Rommel was now forced to retreat all the way to Tunisia. It was also the last battle fought by the Commonwealth alone against the German Empire. In the future, Britain would fight battles together with their US ally.
Nur noch zusammen mit dem US-Verbündeten schlagen.
The US was still fighting its battles in this war exclusively on the islands of the Pacific. In the war against Japan, they were about to leap across the Pacific. Next target, Guadalcanal. Here, the Japanese had built an airfield. From this strategic position, Japanese long-range bombers could easily attack the sea route that connected the US with Australia.
The battle for the Solomon Islands and for the main island of Guadalcanal represented a very important building block in American strategy, the so-called strategy of island hopping. The idea was to approach the Japanese mainland island by island from the south.
Von Süden her kommend an die japanischen Mutterinseln annähern.
For the first time, US forces went on the offensive against Japan. They had prepared for months to capture the enemy strongholds in the Pacific.
The Japanese and the Japanese military were, of course, aware of that, and that's why Guadalcanal was also heavily contested. It was very clear to the Japanese that this was a very important building block for the American strategy of island hopping, and of course also for American strategy when it came to securing Pearl Harbor and Hawaii.
The US Marines accomplished what was previously thought impossible, crossing onto the beach from their ships under fire from coastal batteries. After landing on August 7th, they initially encountered little resistance, but the Japanese would not admit defeat. For half a year, they continued to launch new offensives. The Battle of Guadalcanal went down in US military history as one of the longest and most bitter.
There was the Battle of Guadalcanal, which had been fought for months in the countryside, which was very bloody and very racist. Hardly any prisoners were taken by either side. It was a very drastic battle that went on in the Solomon Islands.
Marines showed their trophies as a sign of victory. The Americans lost nearly 1,500 GIs in ground fighting, the Japanese nearly 15,000. The victory on Guadalcanal secured for US forces an important launching point for future operations. On the other side of the world, the Soviet allies were getting ready for their decisive offensive. Stalingrad was to be that decisive place. More than 200,000 soldiers of the German Wehrmacht and its allies were entrenched in the ruins of the city on the Volga. Reports from reconnaissance planes of heavy Soviet troop concentrations on the opposite bank of the Volga were ignored by the Supreme Army Command. The Sixth Army waged a hopeless battle over a wasteland of rubble.
Der Krieg der Wehrmacht in der Sowjetunion war ja ein Bewegungskrieg, ein Krieg in riesigen.
The Wehrmacht's war in the Soviet Union was, after all, a war of movement, a war in huge spaces, a war in which tank formations surrounded each other, a war that actually did not take place in build-up zones at all, that did not take place in cities at all. The Germans had no rules for fighting in cities. You didn't fight in cities. There were actually very few examples before Stalingrad where the Wehrmacht fought in cities. Now the units were coming into the city, an industrial city, destroyed by German air raids. They weren't prepared for that, and it was very bloody. They should have been called off, but Hitler persevered. And so battalion after battalion was wasted there. The interesting thing about that, and this is overlooked, is that the defenders were outnumbered. Usually, the attacker has the upper hand. But here, in the fighting in the city of Stalingrad, around the train station, around the tractor factory, the Germans were outnumbered, and yet they managed to capture Stalingrad. That showed that craftsmanship, the art of war, the German divisions that were deployed there, they had mastered their craft. But the number of casualties was immense, and of course it was operational nonsense to fight for the last mound of rubble in Stalingrad.
Die Opferzahlen waren natürlich immens, und es war natürlich operativer Unsinn, jetzt auch noch über den letzten Trümmerhügel in Stalingrad zu kämpfen.
Rat war is what the soldiers called fighting in the houses. The Soviet defenders turned every foxhole, every ruined house, every intersection into a fortress from which an unexpected attack could be made. Snipers deliberately executed German soldiers by ambush. The city on the Volga had to be held at all costs.
If Stalingrad had fallen, the front line would have been along the Volga, and that would have been a preliminary decision to extend the German Empire to the Volga and to have access to the Caucasus, and thus to the Middle Eastern countries, which were potentially sympathetic to Germany, such as Iran, for example. On the other hand, that was a prestigious city. It was clear to Stalin that the city that bore his name must not fall. And that's why the Red Army's draconian and cruel measures were particularly extensive in Stalingrad, because of its importance. Here too, one could have said that the Red Army could have taken the city from the beginning. They could have retreated. They would not have had to defend house after house, with an unbelievable number of casualties that exceeded several times the German casualties, and where a Red Army soldier had a few days' chance of surviving.
At the beginning of November, the Wehrmacht had still not succeeded in breaking the Soviet resistance. The Red Army only held about 10% of the city. The Foreign Army's East Department reported that the Soviet Union had no reserves left. Hitler ordered the breakthrough with shock troops. The Führer ignored the concerns of his general staff.
Hitler would not accept turning back. No, we must somehow save ourselves from the situation. No peace agreements. Diplomacy had not been used in this war for a long time. It was either hold, or forward.
Halten oder eben vorwärts. Das war das, was der Führer wollte.
That was what the Führer, who was also the military commander-in-chief, wanted.
Das ist eine Haltung, die auch auf die eigene Bevölkerung, auf die eigenen Volksgenossen, auf die eigenen.
This was an attitude that he extended to his own people. His own people, his own soldiers. He didn't care how many German soldiers fell or were wounded. The main thing was that the oil fields of the Caucasus and the Crimea would be captured or held. That was the most important thing, and those who did not cooperate had to bear the consequences. In Adolf Hitler's mind, this relentlessness was not only directed against external enemies, but also against his own people. If that was the case, then the German Empire, German society, would perish with him.
Das Deutsche Reich, die deutsche Gesellschaft, untergehen.
Hitler brushed aside General Paulus's warning of a major Soviet offensive. On November 8th, he announced the imminent victory at the Löwenbräu in Munich.
Ich wollte zur Wolga kommen, an einer bestimmten Stelle, an einer bestimmten Stadt, weil dort ein ganz wichtiger Punkt ist. Den wollte ich nehmen. Und wissen Sie, wir sind bescheiden. Wir haben ihn nämlich. Es sind nur ein paar ganz kleine Plätzchen noch da. Nun sagen die anderen, warum kämpfen Sie da nicht? Weil ich kein zweites Verdun machen will, sondern weil ich das lieber mit ganz kleinen Stoßtrupps mache.
On November 19th, the Red Army struck back. 4 days after it started, Operation Uranus closed the pocket around Stalingrad. The German troops were doomed. As early as June, Churchill and Roosevelt met in Washington for a planning conference. The British and the Americans promised Stalin help in the fight against the Wehrmacht. The opening of a second front in Europe was intended to relieve the Soviets.
At this point, Churchill and Roosevelt made important strategic decisions. Namely, they said, opening of the Second Front, they wouldn't do it in 1943. They would not land in France in 1943. That was always Stalin's hope. Instead, they would first stabilize the Mediterranean region. And there, with the fall of Tobruk, it was really burning for Churchill. And therefore, one said, one will land with the available means in North Africa, Operation Torch, that is, in Algeria and Morocco, in order to stab Rommel in the back and to stabilize the Mediterranean area. And at the same time, one had to then try to support the Soviet Union to make it materially stronger, because they would not land in 1943 in France. That would only come in 1944.
The Red Army was generously supported with weapons and equipment. The Soviet Union and the Western Allies were now officially allies.
The distrust was always there, of course, this capitalism. This unequal alliance would certainly not have come together if there had not been a common enemy. And that's what the National Socialists were hoping for right up to the end, saying that this unequal coalition couldn't last long. It's bound to break up at some point. But what they underestimated was that a common enemy held this unequal coalition together until the enemy was at last gone.
Mobilizing against this enemy was also a subject for the film industry, especially in the United States. To convince the American public of the need to intervene in the war in Europe, the U.S. Army commissioned a series of propaganda films. From 1942 to 45, director Frank Capra, who had won multiple Oscars, made 7 films entitled Why We Fight. Designed to be shown to American GIs, the series were eventually shown in public cinemas.
Worldwide Army release alone requires 225 prints per subject.
Prelude to War or Nazis Attack were the names of the works that earned Capra another Oscar in 1943 for Best Documentary. They were intended to convince the American nation of the ruthlessness of the enemy, according to the commentary.
And for those who don't like it, you don't eat. Or you disappear into a concentration camp. Or you get this. And this is the man who gives it to you.
In den Vereinigten Staaten stand man vor dem Problem.
In the United States, the problem was to motivate war against the Germans, whom many Americans liked. In contrast to propaganda against Japan, it wasn't possible to fall back on existing racial prejudices.
Dieses Problem löste man, indem man eine Zeit lang
This problem was solved by differentiating between Germans and Nazis. But the longer the war went on, the less willing people were to differentiate between Germans and Nazis, and propaganda messages had to be communicated in a catchy way, which was not conducive to differentiation.
Botschaften mussten ja auch eingängig vermittelt werden, was der Differenzierung nicht dienlich war.
To defeat Nazi Germany, the Americans and the British prepared to land in North Africa and embarked from North America and Britain for the crossing to the Mediterranean. The GIs had no idea what lay ahead of them. For most, the journey to war began as an adventure. Many had never been away from home. They had no combat experience whatsoever. Operation Torch began on November 8, 1942. The plan called for the simultaneous landing of American and British troops around the key ports of Morocco and Algeria, Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Protected by banks of fog dispersed by fighter units, the soldiers approached the coast in assault boats. One platoon, 36 men, fit into each boat. The boats raced ahead at a speed of 9 knots. The new technique of the amphibious landing, which the Americans had used successfully for the first time in the Pacific War, proved to be extremely effective.
When the Allies landed in North Africa in Operation Torch, Hitler didn't decide to withdraw from North Africa, but sent reinforcements to Tunis. And so the fighting in North Africa continued for another 6 months. However, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner in the process.
For these men, the war was over. The relief can be seen on the faces of the Italian soldiers. The disastrous course of the war in North Africa contributed significantly to the decline in power of their Duce Mussolini in the coming year. On November 10th, U.S. troops surrounded Casablanca, Morocco, which was held by forces of the pro-Hitler French government. Since Vichy France had refused to enter the war on the side of Nazi Germany, the Americans had hoped to meet no significant resistance. In fact, the colonial troops surrendered on the same day. There was no fierce battle like the one that took place in Stalingrad.
In North Africa, people were dying by the thousands. So the idea of the chivalrous war, perhaps half the truth. What we can say is, this was not an ideological war. The murder of prisoners, which was commonplace in the Soviet Union, that didn't happen. The mass murder of civilians, partisan warfare, all of this did not exist in North Africa. Of course, there were civilians in North Africa. There was also forced labor. Libya was, after all, an Italian colony. There were even Libyan Jews who were taken to the mainland and killed there. But the character of the war in North Africa was ultimately a completely different one. The scale was completely different. So if you look at World War II as a total war, we find relatively few traces of it in North Africa.
Dann finden wir davon eben relativ wenige Spuren in Nordafrika.
Rommel's Africa Corps had to withdraw all the way to Tunisia. Now, the Allies threatened to stab him in the back. In Oran, the defenders had surrendered on November 9th. In Algiers, members of the resistance simultaneously staged a coup against the military of the Vichy regime, which was allied with Nazi Germany. Field Marshal Rommel's troops were now coming under pressure. Nevertheless, German propaganda continued to portray him as a glorious commander, probably because the Desert Fox had been able to turn seemingly hopeless situations into surprising victories on several occasions.
North Africa was probably the theater of war where it went back and forth the most. There were several German offensives. There were several British offensives. The game ball there was always the so-called Cyrenaica. It always depended on how far the respective side could supply its troops. That is, if one side advanced further, it went further and further away from its supply lines, and the other, which retreated, got closer to its supply lines. And that's how the whole thing came together like a rubber band. It went back and forth all the time.
The British 8th Army, commanded by Bernard Montgomery, advanced from the east, and the newly arrived U.S. forces, commanded by Dwight D. Eisenhower, advanced from the west. The German troops were entangled in retreating battles and faced a double superiority. To escape total annihilation, the Germans had to retreat further and further. German troops and their allies recorded about 250,000 dead, wounded, and prisoners at the end of this battle. Meanwhile, a secret conference took place in Casablanca, Morocco on January 14th. U.S. President Roosevelt arrived and inspected an honor formation of the American Armed Forces. Afterwards, he met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and together they set the invasion of Italy as the war's next objective. To end the war, they demanded no less than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Stalin agreed with this demand.
Die Alliierten hatten ja 1943 auf der Konferenz von Casablanca erklärt,
At the Casablanca Conference in 1943, the Allies had declared there could be nothing other than unconditional surrender. In other words, it was clear to everyone there was only total defeat or victory. There couldn't be anything in between. The war could only end with Germany's unconditional surrender and occupation. So now you have to put yourself in the head of a Prussian officer. It was inconceivable that someone would surrender without the last bullet having been shot.
und dass es da keinen Ausweg gibt. Und das hat Hitler auf perfide Weise ausgenutzt, dass man sich diese preußischen...
And there was no way out. And Hitler exploited this in a perfidious way. These Prussian notions of honor and rank were exploited to get these people to keep fighting. It may have been an error on the part of the Allies, but they had learned the lesson from the First World War. If this must not happen again, then there must be no way out of it. But on the other hand, hopelessness is always something that drives all dictators all over the world to the extreme.
dazu bringen lässt, es bis zum Äußersten kommen zu lassen.
While Nazi propaganda denounced Allied policy as a war of extermination against Germany, German troops in North Africa lost battle after battle in the spring of 1943. The defeated enemies were interned in prison camps for the rest of the war in accordance with the Geneva Convention. The British and Americans were now able to decode almost all German radio transmissions and were therefore well informed about Axis plans. The German defeat in North Africa was only a matter of time. January 10, 1942. In the Wolf's Lair near Rastenburg in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler welcomed Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu. The troops of the Allied powers faced the Red Army on the Eastern Front and had fought together on the Volga River that winter.
The pictures of January 1943 were set against the background of the catastrophe at Stalingrad. 2 Romanian armies had been sent to the Eastern Front at Hitler's request. In 41, early 42, they asked the Romanians, now do a little bit more, and those things were gone now. There were huge losses. And Stalingrad had quite a big political effect. Hitler, of course, had to try to keep his allies fighting, of whom Romania was actually the most important, because the Romanians had the most soldiers on the Eastern Front.
The meeting of the Führer and the Romanian leader served another purpose. At a time of imminent defeat at Stalingrad, it was necessary to demonstrate confidence publicly.
It had a very great effect in showing the German people that we still had allies, because the anti-Hitler coalition was growing bigger and bigger, and more Germans were asking themselves how they were supposed to manage against this huge coalition, which by now spanned half the world.
However, for the soldiers of the Axis powers in Stalingrad, there was no justification for the display of optimism. The battle for the industrial and armaments center had been raging since August of 1942. After heavy bombardment by the Luftwaffe, German units advanced into the city. Despite initial successes, however, the offensive came to a halt.
The Wehrmacht's war in the Soviet Union was, after all, a war of movement, a war in huge spaces, a war that actually didn't take place in cities at all. The Germans had no regulations at all for fighting in cities. And now these units come into this city, an industrial city destroyed by German air raids, and they were not prepared for that. It was very bloody. It should have been stopped, but Hitler persevered. And so battalion after battalion was wasted there.
The Sixth Army was receiving fewer and fewer supplies and was slowly bleeding to death in the ruins of the city. By mid-October, its commander-in-chief, Colonel General Friedrich Paulus, had only about 25,000 combatants left out of 250,000 soldiers, and they faced an enemy fighting fanatically.
What happened there was pretty dramatic, how people were really sent into the fire and burned up. Even the Germans noted in their reports, shaking their heads, at points there were already masses of dead or destroyed tanks. Even then, the generals sent their troops into the fire again and again. It has to be said, with many Soviet military leaders, there was a complete contempt for the life of their own soldiers.
Hitler had estimated just 8 days for the so-called Operation Heron, the capture of Stalingrad. An insane miscalculation, because even after weeks of fighting, the city could not be completely taken. The Red Army brought in reserves from the east and repeatedly threw fresh forces into the battle. In mid-November, the Soviets launched a counteroffensive called Operation Uranus. It succeeded in encircling the Axis soldiers. Here, we see propaganda film intended to show the moment when the circle around Stalingrad closed. And while an army was headed for downfall on the Volga, some 3,000 kilometers to the west, there were celebrations. January 12, 1943, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring had invited guests to his Kardenhall estate in Brandenburg to celebrate his 50th birthday.
Göring was the most decorated German soldier of the Second World War, which many were not aware of, because the Grand Cross, which he received in July 1940, was above the Knight's Cross and was awarded only to him. And he also had a rank, the Reichsmarschall, which was above Feldmarschall, which actually didn't exist. And that's interesting and important in that sense, because the order and the rank made it clear what Göring was. He was the number 2 man in the country, the designated successor to Hitler.
The birthday boy had pompously announced that his air force would supply the trapped troops in Stalingrad with ammunition and food, even though he must have been aware of the hopelessness of that undertaking.
He despaired, and he then tried to score points with Hitler again by saying, "Yes, I'm supplying the 6th Army in Stalingrad." And that didn't work. So he got hit on the head, and he didn't see any way to stop it. So we have records of his meetings with his staff, and he understood what was at stake. He knew how difficult the situation was, but then he always said that in the end, I have to go to Hitler now and I have to sell it to him. Give me better news. And it went so far that people put in writing how difficult the situation was, and he tore up that document.
Leute aufschreiben, wie schwierig die Lage ist, und zerreißt dieses Dokument.
While Göring was feeling sorry for himself, the trapped soldiers received only pathetic slogans of perseverance instead of the hoped-for rations by air. A speech by the Air Force chief was broadcast all the way to the Volga and must have sounded like sheer mockery to the infantrymen.
Es ist letzten Endes, das mag hart klingen, ja für den Soldaten gleichgültig. Aber bei Stalingrad, bei Resch, ob in den Wüsten Afrikas oder oben im Eis Norwegens, stirbt und fällt. Wenn sein Opfer bringt, ist es gleich groß. Immer bringt es für das Leben seines Volkes.
The situation in the surrounded city continued to deteriorate. Cold, epidemics, and hunger took their toll. At the beginning of January, the daily ration for a soldier in the Stalingrad cauldron was barely 50 grams of bread, no more than a slice. A German soldier noted, "The truth is the knowledge of the hardest struggle in a hopeless situation. Misery, hunger, cold, renunciation, doubt, despair, and horrific death. That's all I'll say about it." Despite the increasingly hopeless situation, surrender was out of the question for Hitler. Defiantly, he ordered the city to be held at all costs. At the end of January, he appointed Friedrich Paulus, commander-in-chief of the 6th Army, as field marshal. The hope was that an officer of such rank would choose suicide rather than surrender.
Friedrich Paulus was disillusioned by the fact that all attempts of his to get his permission from Hitler to surrender at Stalingrad in order to save lives was rejected by Hitler. And at that moment he actually felt betrayed and abandoned. And for this dictator to still take a bullet in the head, that's where he said no. Doing that would mean I would take the responsibility. And the responsibility for the death and failure in Stalingrad is not mine, but Hitler's. And he simply didn't want to take the responsibility. He didn't want to take the responsibility for this defeat, to wear that hat.
On January 31st, Friedrich Paulus, the highest-ranking German officer up to that time, went into Soviet captivity. A few days later, the last Axis units in the city surrendered. After more than 5 months, the Battle of Stalingrad was over.
Aus dem Führerhauptquartier 3. Februar 1943. Das Oberkommando der Wehrmacht gibt bekannt. Der Kampf um Stalingrad ist zu Ende. Ihrem Fahneneid getreu ist die 6. Armee unter der vorbildlichen Führung des Generalfeldmarschalls Paulus der Übermacht des Feindes und der Ungunst der Verhältnisse erlegen.
First of all, there was shock. It was only written down in the diaries or in the secret morale reports that the people were shocked. They couldn't imagine it. An entire army had perished, sacrificed. In those days, defeats were associated with symbols, with the surrender of armies, with the surrender of countries. And the defeat of Moscow was not connected with the surrender of any army, with any symbolic act. The Germans were repulsed, and they lost 200,000 soldiers. But this didn't appear in any statistics. Stalingrad was the first symbolic place where the Wehrmacht suffered a defeat. It couldn't be hidden. The Battle of Moscow could be retouched a little. Stalingrad couldn't.
About half of the trapped soldiers died during the battle. Only a few tens of thousands were lucky enough to be flown out. In February, the remaining 100,000 men were dragged into captivity. Of that amount, only about 6% survived and returned to Germany years later.
On the German side, of course, the blame for the defeat at Stalingrad was aimed primarily on the Allies. But of course, it was wrong to shift the blame onto the Allies, which Hitler did. That's why he said in the summer of 1943 that he wanted to carry out the summer offensive only with German troops, so that something like Stalingrad wouldn't happen again. But of course, critical mistakes were also made on the German side, and even without the Allies, the outcome certainly would not have been different.
The mood in Germany was devastating. In mid-February, Joseph Goebbels addressed a select audience in Berlin's Sportpalast. His speech was broadcast on the radio.
Engländer behaupten, das deutsche Volk wehrt sich gegen die totalen Kriegsmaßnahmen der Regierung. Es will nicht den totalen Krieg, sagen die Engländer, sondern die Kapitulation.
Goebbels' speech in the Sports Palace was definitely a key event.
Es ist ganz sicher ein ganz zentrales Ereignis, weil
because at a critical moment he tried to finally commit the masses to total war.
Die Massen nun endgültig auf den totalen Krieg einzutrimmen.
Total war also meant radical, comprehensive social mobilization of all available resources.
Umfassende gesellschaftliche Mobilisierung aller noch zur Verfügung stehenden Ressourcen.
The Minister of Propaganda asked 10 rhetorical questions, which were ecstatically received.
Das Interessante ist allerdings daran, dass
The interesting thing, however, was that he actually spoke in a style that would have been more appropriate, let's say, in the spring of 1945. or even the fall of 44, because living conditions for Germans in February of 43 weren't so bad at first. It was before the Allied air offensive on the Ruhr or on Hamburg.
Ja, es gibt Bombenkrieg, aber der kommt, das wirklich Schlimme kommt erst noch.
Yes, there was bombing, but the really bad stuff was yet to come. The fronts were far away in Russia. Germany dominated France. German soldiers were also in Tunisia. The, let's say, average Berliner who was listening was certainly in a different mood in February 43. And Goebbels, of course, knew what was coming and had more information. So in that respect, it was a speech that was actually much too radical for the atmosphere that prevailed in Berlin at that time.
A few months earlier, the German public was still used to hearing success stories. The Wehrmacht had advanced as far as the Caucasus.
Feind unterm Silbersadel! Los, los, Dalli, Dalli!
Halt! An der Gamswand! 1, 2, 3, 4. Das werden ja immer mehr. Ein bolschewistischer Umgehungsstoßtrupp. Fein ausgedacht. Geschütz, Richtung Gamswand. Größte Entfernung. Schneller, schneller!
Alarm at the Pass was the title of a propaganda film that was supposed to document the alleged success. Hans Ettel, who had previously made a name for himself as Leni Riefenstahl's cameraman, shot the film with mountain troops on location.
Das hat gewirkt. Nun türmen Sie. Den Heimweg werden wir Ihnen versalzen.
The German advance, however, soon only succeeded on celluloid. The vast gains of territory in the Caucasus, initially aided by Soviet retreats, resulted in significant supply problems of fuel and ammunition. The overstretched supply routes contributed to the Wehrmacht having to withdraw from the mountain range between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea from the turn of the year, 1942 to 1943. Therefore, when Alarm at the Pass was finished, Goebbels refused to release the film to theaters. In other areas of the Eastern Front, the situation continued to deteriorate for the Wehrmacht and its allies. After the victory at Stalingrad in early 1943, the Red Army tried to use this momentum for themselves.
In the southern section of the Eastern Front, the Red Army launched two major offensives, Offensive Stern and Offensive Sprung. Initially, with Offensive Sprung, and then also with Stern, Stalin tried to cut off the entire southern wing of the German Eastern Front and liberate Crimea and destroy all of the German forces in the south of the Eastern Front and advance to Dnieper.
In many places, the Wehrmacht had no choice but to retreat. Here was the official language of the situation in the propaganda, a lesson in whitewashing.
Im Süden der Ostfront. Unsere Truppen setzen sich in beweglicher Kampfführung vom Feind ab. Alle militärischen Einrichtungen und Verkehrsanlagen werden planmäßig zerstört.
Kharkov was also targeted by the Red Army. The city had been under German control since October of 1941. Idyllic images of the occupation belie the reality. For example, most of the Jewish population had been murdered. In mid-February 1943, the Red Army recaptured the city, but the Wehrmacht did not admit defeat.
Then the Germans managed to bring in reserves and recaptured Kharkov in a counter-offensive in March of 43, and then managed to roughly recapture their initial starting position from the summer of 42. But those were very critical days when it wasn't clear whether the Germans would even succeed in stopping the Soviets again. Or was that now a Napoleonic catastrophe? Napoleon, who retreated from Moscow once, also no longer found a way to stop, but at some point that then degenerated into a retreat. And that danger certainly existed in February of 43. And the Germans could have stopped that with a counter-offensive. They could stabilize the front line and then thus conclude these winter battles.
The success at Kharkov temporarily belied the balance of power in the southern section of the Eastern Front, and German soldiers were all too willing to be blinded.
The morale of the soldiers was stabilized once again because the soldiers said to themselves, well, we're still superior. We're tactically superior to the Soviets. We're actually also superior in terms of weapons, and the Führer knows what he's doing. And they were still optimistic. The morale reports also said that even in the spring, the soldiers who rode from the front line or came on leave from the front line were actually more optimistic than the public. They also reassured the people and said, no, we're superior.
In the capital of the Reich, the long-awaited success on the Eastern Front was exploited to great public effect. Adolf Hitler appeared on Heroes Memorial Day in front of the Zeughaus on Unter den Linden, along with representatives of the Luftwaffe, the Army, and the Navy, Hermann Göring, Wilhelm Keitel, Karl Dönitz, as well as Heinrich Himmler. The holiday had been specifically postponed so that the Führer could announce the recapture of the then fourth largest city in the Soviet Union. It was the Führer's first public appearance since the fall of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad.
In seiner Rede wies der Führer auf die gigantischen Vorbereitungen hin, die der Bolschewismus zur Vernichtung Europas getroffen hatte. Heute erfüllt uns allein heiße Liebe zur Heimat und zu unserem Volke und brennender Hass gegen jeden Feind. Die deutsche Wehrmacht verwandelt sich immer mehr in eine kämpfende Nation. Die Toten dieses Zweiten Weltkrieges werden nicht vergeblich gefallen sein, sondern als unvergängliche Helden und Pioniere eines besseren Zeitalters in unseren Reihen für ewig weiterleben.
Hitler also gave a speech on Heroes Memorial Day, but a very short one. I think it was only a quarter of an hour long or so. Nothing at all compared to the usual pre-war speeches of 3 or 4 hours. And we know that from the mood reports of the security service that moviegoers were terribly disappointed because while it was shown in the newsreel, no original recordings were played of Hitler or how his voice sounded. At the time, they really clung to it. How does the Führer look? They also watched his face closely in the newsreels. Is he positive? What is he saying? How does he say it? And then the newsreel announcer only summarized what Hitler said. And they were all terribly disappointed. And Goebbels tried for months to persuade Hitler to give a public speech again, to finally give the people hope again. Hitler didn't want that at all. He always said, first we need victories again. In that situation, he didn't want to do that.
Further disappointments were to follow. For example, in the North African theater. Since February of '41, German units had been fighting there alongside the Italians. For a long time, Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps had been a source of success. The tank general had previously made a name for himself in the Western campaign against France and was now presented by Nazi propaganda as a brilliant army commander. The image of the strategically skilled Desert Fox was very popular throughout the Reich.
Marschall Rommel hat den Entschluss zum überraschenden Angriff auf die 8. britische Armee gefasst. Wie immer befindet er sich unmittelbar bei der kämpfenden Truppe. Günther Halm ist erst 19 Jahre alt. Als Richtschütze einer Pak schoss er unter schwierigsten Bedingungen 7 Britenpanzer ab.
Wer so ein Kerl ist, der wird immer so ein Kerl sein. Bei jeder Gelegenheit. Das erwarte ich natürlich von Ihnen.
But ever since the Allies landed massive forces in North Africa at the end of 1942 in what was called Operation Torch, which opened a second front in the rear of the Afrika Korps, the troops of the Axis powers were increasingly on the defensive. At first, Berlin did not recognize the signs of the times.
Hitler forbade withdrawing troops from Tunisia. On the contrary, he continued to pump more troops in there. That was typical of Hitler. There is this Nazi will to preserve, defending at all costs, to the last grenade.
Despite the increasingly hopeless military situation, the Afrika Korps put up fierce resistance. Here are pictures taken by U.S. frontline cameramen of tough fighting near Tunis. Personnel consequences on the German side came only later.
Rommel
was in North Africa until the beginning of March 1943 and was then recalled because defeat was clear and the regime didn't want to see one of the most popular generals go into captivity. And besides, they still needed him for propaganda in the further course of the war.
The Allies now had 4 times as many tanks in North Africa as the Axis powers and had air supremacy. In mid-May 1943, the German-Italian units under Rommel's successor, Colonel General von Arnim, formed Army Group Africa and surrendered near Tunis.
That then ended in a military catastrophe compared by some to the magnitude of the defeat at Stalingrad. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers went into captivity. Militarily, the defeat in Tunis was the second very serious defeat for the German Reich after Stalingrad. It became clear that it had lost the initiative on several fronts and their important ally Italy was on the verge of collapse.
Der wichtigste Verbündete Italien steht kurz vor dem Aus.
Thus, another of Hitler's military ventures came to an abrupt end. In addition to hundreds of thousands of soldiers going into captivity, there were at least 30,000 casualties on the side of the Axis powers. On May 20th, the Allies celebrated their victory with a military parade in Tunis. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Allied Commander-in-Chief during Operation Torch and later the U.S. President, attended the triumphal procession. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "No one could doubt the greatness of the victory won in Tunisia. Africa has been cleansed of the enemy. A continent has been liberated." Increased efforts in the German armaments industry helped compensate for the growing military superiority of the Allies. Albert Speer had been responsible for armaments manufacturing since February of 1944, had reorganized it. In addition to weapons, Speer, who was equally popular with the Führer and the people, was primarily concerned with his image.
Albert Speer, one can say, was first and foremost a man of staging and propaganda, not the least of which was the staging of himself. So we first had a so-called home front propaganda, which systematically referred to the production wonders and the achievements of the German armaments industry, and which then very soon also became intoxicated with its own successes. But Albert Speer actually succeeded in significantly increasing output in certain armament sectors.
The increases were due to the systematic importation of foreign workers to the Reich, which was further accelerated under Speer. Thus, men and women from the occupied territories toiled in German factories for the insane idea of final victory. Hundreds of thousands suffered from malnutrition and mistreatment or worked themselves to death.
Forced laborers were quite central to the German armaments industry and for this war machine in general. Just imagine that in 1944 there were 7.6 million forced laborers in the German Reich, and they kept the armaments industry and industrial war production going. This meant that the use of forced laborers was a central element of the National Socialist war ideology and war economy. They were becoming increasingly important and were being brought into the Reich at ever greater expense because they were a substitute, a cheap substitute for the conscripted Germans who were in the Wehrmacht. Forced labor was, on the whole, a program that was changing quite dramatically. In the overall tendency, one could say that with the way in which warfare had become more radicalized and how the military tactical situation had also deteriorated and became more acute, that to the same extent, the ruthlessness with which forced laborers had been treated became more and more acute.
Speer also displayed particular creativity when it came to presenting his production figures.
It's also important to emphasize that Albert Speer always argued with growth rates that were indeed immense. But he liked to refer to certain base dates when production was particularly low, and that these rates of increase were particularly impressive. And he really avoided ever stating absolute production figures and possibly relating them to the production process potential of their opponents. Of course, the German economy didn't come close to what the Americans in particular, and also what the Soviets produced. Even if it was possible to increase the economy enormously, this was helped strongly by the assembly line procedure. On the German side, there was only one factory making tanks, the Nibelungen factory, which worked with an assembly line method. For the Americans, this was standard, and the Germans simply couldn't match it.
This fact was neglected in Nazi propaganda. Instead, they emphasized the alleged superiority of their own weapons. In the summer of 1943, Albert Speer and Joseph Goebbels attended a staged tank race, the result of which was probably already set before the start.
Waffen in der Erprobung. Der Panther beim Vergleichsfahren mit einem amerikanischen General Lee. In der Mitte der amerikanische Panzer. Über ein steiles Betonhindernis. Der amerikanische Panzer bezwingt es nicht und bestätigt erneut die in der letzten Zeit immer wieder gemachten Aussagen unserer Gegner, dass unsere Panzer und Waffen den ihren überlegen sind.
The completed tanks were urgently needed to, at least partially, compensate for the Wehrmacht's heavy material losses. Many combat vehicles left the factory for the Eastern Front, where new offensive plans were now being made after the recapture of Kharkov in March of that year.
Everyone was aware that the forces were not enough for a large-scale offensive as in 1941 and 1942, but there was a frontal advance around the city of Kursk. So we could start an offensive, gain ground and demonstrate that you could still attack and keep the initiative.
Und vor allen Dingen zeigen, dass wir noch angreifen können und die Initiative behalten.
About 120 kilometers of the frontal advance around the city of Kursk protruded into the German lines. It was to be straightened as part of an offensive that was given the code name Citadel. Operational Order Number 6 from April of 1943 stated, "Every leader, every man must be imbued with the decisive importance of this attack. The victory at Kursk must act as a beacon to the world." About 900,000 men were pulled together for this on the German side. They were opposed by at least 1.4 million Red Army troops, and they were prepared when the German attack started in early July.
Within this frontal arc, the Red Army had created a defense system with a total of 6 defense belts, and these defense lines, which were riddled with anti-tank trenches with mines. Hundreds of thousands of mines were laid and thousands of kilometers of trenches were dug with anti-tank bases and so on. It was actually a very difficult system to penetrate.
In the coming days, the largest tank battle of the Second World War unfolded at Kursk. The shortcomings of the German armaments industry under Albert Speer quickly became apparent.
At the time, the Germans had an enormous number of tanks, but they had no spare parts. It would have been better, if you will, to actually produce 3 tanks and produce 3 tanks as spare parts. But Speer preferred to produce 5 tanks and only 1 as a spare. And by the first day of the attack of Operation Citadel, 1 heavy tank division with Tigers had so many failures due to mines, but no spare parts. Right on first day, it wasn't possible to repair all tanks. And that was a consequence of Speer's policy, always to impress only with production figures, but nothing behind it in resources, where one could say, we have enough spare parts, enough mechanics. All right, we're covered. Even if we have failures, we can balance it out.
In einer Panzerwerkstatt an der Ostfront. Ein Panzer wird in seine Hauptteile zerlegt, durchgesehen und wieder kampffähig gemacht.
In the Battle of Kursk, the tank units had to fear not only the Red Army, but also the vulnerability of their own combat vehicles. In addition to Type 4 models, newer tanks, such as the Panther, were also used. However, they had numerous technical shortcomings. A member of the 1st Division of the SS Panzer Regiment II noted, We had to take these cripples into action with, of course, quite clearly expected results. Propaganda studiously concealed such experiences.
Die Arbeit ist getan. Die Besatzung fährt mit ihrem Kampfwagen wieder an die Front.
In the Battle of the Front Arc, the Wehrmacht faced an almost inexhaustible reservoir of Soviet units. After initial moderate gains in space, the large-scale offensive came to a halt.
After about 2 weeks at the latest, the German offensive was over and the Soviet side was on the counter-offensive. And then the second phase of the Battle of Kursk was, at least from the German point of view, purely characterized by heavy defensive fighting. That you tried to hold the front arc of Oral as long as possible, at least to cover the retreat.
In mid-August, the Red Army recaptured Kharkov for the second time that year. The fighting that went down in history as the Battle of Kursk thus came to an end, with immense losses on both sides.
During the 50-day Kursk battle, the Red Army lost about 7,000 tanks. That means broken, burned out, exploded. About 7,000 tanks. The Wehrmacht had about 1,200 tanks, and so you have a loss ratio of 1 to 6. With airplanes, the loss ratio was about 1 to 5. On the German side, you had a total of 650 destroyed aircraft. On the Soviet side, at least 3,000. But the most difficult thing, however, was to determine the personnel losses. On the German side, they were about 200,000 men. On the Soviet side, at least 1.2 million. As a result of the tank battle of Kursk, it became clear no matter what they did, no matter how many Soviet tanks they shot down, no matter how many soldiers they captured or died in the Red Army, they couldn't win this militarily. And this raised the question, what were the Germans supposed to do? They couldn't really do anything anymore, because they couldn't destroy more than 6,000 tanks in a few weeks. Any other army would have had its back broken. Not so the Red Army. And so it became clear in Operation Citadel that the Germans could do whatever they wanted. This had become a material war, which the Germans couldn't win.
Operation Citadel was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From then on, more and more, the Red Army took the initiative. On the 26th of August, a few days after the end of the Battle of Kursk, it launched a new offensive. The high command of the Wehrmacht, meanwhile, had been faced with new developments in another theater of war for several weeks.
On July 10, 1943, the Allies landed in Sicily. At that very moment, Operation Citadel was about a week old, and at that moment Hitler actually lost his nerve a bit. He then contributed to the attack being stopped a few days later, and he wanted to move his Waffen-SS divisions all away from the Eastern Front. In the end, only one Waffen-SS division, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, was moved to northern Italy. But of course, it showed the interaction of the individual theaters of war. It was a continental war that the Germans faced there. Different fronts, France, the Mediterranean, the Soviet Union. And they were interconnected and interlocked with each other. And the Allies had the upper hand in mid-43. They had the initiative and they could determine where to attack.
For the landing, the Allies had pulled together over 100,000 troops, including soldiers from the 1st U.S. Infantry Division, the Big Red One. The tradition-rich unit had previously fought in North Africa and was now helping bring Sicily under Allied control in about a week. Everywhere, Americans, Canadians, and British were encountering the legacies of fascist rule. Destroyed war equipment was repurposed by local youth in the blink of an eye. The fall of Sicily caused consternation in war-weary Italy, which quickly turned into revolutionary sentiment and led to personnel consequences.
Mussolini was deposed by the fascist Grand Council on July 25, 1941. There was also the King Victor Emmanuel III, and so Mussolini was no longer the Duce.
Pietro Badoglio became the new prime minister. Officially, the general emphasized that he wanted to continue fighting alongside the Third Reich, but Italy and the Western powers were unofficially approaching each other. Secret peace negotiations were opened. During the fight for Sicily, about 4,600 Wehrmacht soldiers were killed. Over 13,000 were injured. Those who could not be cared for locally were transferred home. Clinics for the treatment and rehabilitation of the wounded were set up throughout the Reich, like here in Bielefeld in Westphalia. A doctor filmed the progress of his patients.
At the moment when more and more fatally wounded people streamed back from the front, it became clear to everyone that this would not have a good ending. Of course, the propaganda in the Reich tried to glorify that.
Television was still in its infancy, but it was used for propaganda. For example, many clinics had TV sets where the wounded could see their fellow sufferers.
Frohsinn und Wille meistern das Schicksal. Das ist die Losung unserer Schwerkriegsbeschädigten. Für ihre Zukunft wird gesorgt und neben der selbstverständlichen rein körperlichen Heilung durch eine griffsichere Chirurgie muss die Hauptaufgabe des Arztes darin bestehen, den Amputierten zu helfen, die seelischen Hemmnisse zu überwinden, die die Verwundung mit sich bringt. Die Amputierten durchlaufen eine Hindernisbahn, 100 Meter lang, mit schweren Hindernissen. Im Anfang ein Irrgarten, der schnelles Reaktionsvermögen verlangt. Zu dem Sprung gehört Mut. Wehe, wer hier hängen bleibt. Wie die Wiesel.
Whether the camera accompanied war-disabled people on an obstacle course or at a dance class, the motto was always, everything's not so bad.
Nicht wahr, es geht doch ganz nett.
Ja, fabelhaft.
Das hätte ich mir nie träumen lassen, als ich schwer verwundet in Russland lag, dass ich noch einmal tanzen würde.
Haben Sie früher sehr gern getanzt?
Nein, ich habe noch nie getanzt. Ich habe es jetzt erst als Amputierter gelernt.
Sie haben doch beide Beine amputiert.
Ja.
Doch macht es Ihnen Freude.
Das Leben ist doch schön.
The staged images seem cynical from today's perspective, but in the cold logic of the regime, the images made sense.
The cleverness of the Nazi propaganda was that they showed that they didn't pretend that no one was killed. They also didn't pretend that there were no wounded. No, there were. You could see them in the streets. They were openly shown. But they were also made into heroes. They had sacrificed themselves. They had also paid their price. And we also recognize that. Society recognizes that. That's why we also showed them in the newsreel, as well as invalid soldiers in a convalescent home and so on. And with that, Nazi propaganda created a piece of honesty. If you didn't show that, if you only made beautiful pictures of healthy soldiers, then it would have become untrustworthy, because everybody saw them on the street, the limping people. And propaganda must always, in order to be effective, contain a piece of truth.
On the 8th of September, the previously negotiated ceasefire between Italy on one side and the US and Britain on the other became public knowledge.
Armistice with Italy has been concluded. It is a great victory for the United Nations, but it was also a great victory for the Italian people. After years of war and suffering and degradation, the Italian people are at last coming to the day of liberation from their real enemies, the Nazis.
American and British troops began landing on the Italian mainland in early September near Salerno. In Berlin, preparations had been made for this eventuality. Fall Axis was the code name of the operation, which now responded to the Allied landing operation.
And the Germans made many mistakes, but one thing they could do was to react quickly to new situations. They initiated Operation Axis and managed to disarm hundreds of thousands of Italian soldiers and relatively quickly confronted the advancing Allies.
The Allies had to fight their way north with great difficulty. Only months later was a US cameraman able to shoot this footage in the Campania region. In the meantime, the other side achieved a brief success. Since his deposition, Benito Mussolini had been held prisoner in a hotel in Abruzzo.
The Germans learned about it, and the idea now on the German side was to free Mussolini. There was a command operation. German command landed near the mountain hotel. And the interesting thing was, why didn't the guards actually just shoot Mussolini? Why didn't they fight the German paratroopers? Today, we know that the official Italian government said, well, then let the Germans have Mussolini, and quite deliberately gave the order not to shoot.
Und also ganz bewusst den Befehl gibt, nicht zu schießen.
In mid-September, Hitler received the liberated ally at the Wolf's Lair. The Duce was to preside over the so-called Republic of Salo on Lake Garda and, as Hitler's puppet, lead a fascist counter-government of Italy. In April of 1944, it would perish along with its leader. Dresden, June 1943. Karin Klipken and Henry Ruppe exchanged wedding vows, meticulously documented on 35mm color film. It was a piece of idyll, almost 4 years after Adolf Hitler had plunged the world into war. The effects of the war were still barely felt in the city, which was not within range of Allied bomber raids, a situation that would not last forever. Ever since the British Air Ministry had issued the Area Bombing Directive in February of 1942, the number of air raids on German cities had increased significantly. The suffering of civilians in particular was growing.
It was the British who, more than any other air power, developed a system for destroying a city with an airstrike. And the British developed a method which they refined in 1943. The proportion of incendiary bombs, for example, was much higher than in the German attacks, and so was the tactic of using air mines. How that was coordinated and how they used radio control methods, master bombers that guided the others. That was a completely new procedure. It was now no longer if we kill civilians, we kill civilians. But the civilians became the main target.
One area of focus for the attacks was the Ruhr region with its heavy industry. The images of destruction were the same from city to city. Among other cities in the rural area, Dortmund also became a target. On the night of May 24th alone, 2,200 tons of incendiary and demolition bombs fell on the city. The Nazi leadership responded with a large-scale propaganda event.
Nun wird Dr. Goebbels in Dortmund zu der schwer geprüften Bevölkerung sprechen und die Grüße des ganzen deutschen Volkes überbringen, das den harten Kampf seiner Brüder in den luftbedrohten Gebieten um Sein oder Nichtsein mit tiefer innerer Anteilnahme verfolgt.
The venue for the production, the Westfalenhalle, filled with over 15,000 spectators. Empty slogans of perseverance for the population of the Ruhr region, which had been shaken by the air war.
Dr. Goebbels sagte in seiner Rede unter anderem, ich weiß, dass ihr hier einem schweren Terror ausgesetzt seid. Die Leiden, die euch durch den feindlichen Luftkrieg aufgezwungen werden, sind quälend und peinigend. Über den Belastungen des Tages dürfen wir nicht den Überblick über die Gesamtproblematik dieses Krieges verlieren. In keinem Augenblick dieses gigantischen Kampfes dürfen wir vergessen, dass es um Sein oder Nichtsein unseres Volkes und damit jedes einzelnen Deutschen geht. Wenn man sein eigenes Volk aus tiefster Seele lieben will, dann muss man seine Feinde auch aus tiefster Seele hassen können.
Ich bin der Überzeugung, in diesem Kriege, wieder in allen Kriegen, der siegen wird, der die stärksten Nerven, die meisten Faustbänder und die tapferste und die genialste Führung gewinnt. Das sind nicht unsere Feinde, das sind wir.
The Battle of the Ruhr, which was a Royal Air Force offensive, raged between March and July of 1943, during which almost all major German cities on the Rhine and Ruhr were bombed and thousands of people were killed. The regime tried to alleviate the plight of the victims.
Zu den
One of the clever responses to the chaos caused by such carpet bombing was that certain consumer goods were kept in railroad cars until they were needed, some of which were also parked in tunnels. And then they would be available at relatively short notice.
Die Frauenschaft verteilt Butterbrote für die Bombengeschädigten. Eier, Zigaretten, Obst, an alles ist gedacht. Die Hilfsorganisationen leisten mustergültige Arbeit.
If you were cynical, you'd say that Nazi propaganda and Goebbels used the bombings as an opportunity to expand the people's sense of community, the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft, because they understood great need, great suffering, we have to help. And who helped? The Nazi state.
In the face of massive destruction and high casualty figures, pessimism and resentment spread. However, open criticism of the situation was not tolerated under the Nazi dictatorship.
In the language of the National Socialists, there was a separation between morale and attitude, and the morale could easily crumble at one point or another. The regime also acknowledged that, or that there was mourning over losses or worries and hardships after bombing raids. But at the same time, the decisive element was the attitude in the language of Nazi propaganda, and the attitude from the regime's point of view seemed to be quite stable for a long time.
In midsummer 1943, Hamburg became the focus of Allied bombers. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, around 1.7 million people lived in the Hanseatic city. Warships were also built there, which provided work for tens of thousands of people. That is why, since 1940, the Hanseatic city had repeatedly been the target of air raids. In late July, the Allies launched Operation Gomorrah, named after the mythical city that, according to the Bible, was buried under a rain of fire and brimstone.
Operation Gomorrah was a terrifying, horrific special event in the air war. The British managed to knock out the German defense by building German radars with strips of aluminium foil, thus eliminating the German night fighter force. Therefore, these bombers could fly over the city relatively undisturbed. Hamburg was easy to get to. Hamburg was easy to find. They also had radar devices that could find and hit the city with relative precision.
Hamburg was attacked in several waves. The most devastating occurred on the night of July 27th. More than 100,000 explosive and incendiary bombs fell on the city, which quickly went up in flames. The hot midsummer weather that prevailed during those days bolstered the spread of the fires.
They attacked certain districts east of the Ulster, which were densely built up, and the British managed to set off a firestorm in this densely built-up area. And it was this firestorm that was destructive and deadly, because the attack was long over. The fire developed such power, a hurricane-like force, and it couldn't be extinguished. And so Hamburg burned for days, and even the Hamburg Fire Department and the Hamburg Civil Defense were not immune to the bombing, and that's why the civilian casualty figures were so immensely high.
The firestorm raged for over 5 hours in eastern Hamburg. Many streets in the city center also fell victim to the bombardment. By the end of Operation Gomorrah, a total of around 35,000 people had been killed. They suffocated in air raid shelters, burned to death in the streets, or were killed by falling debris. Over 100,000 residents were injured. In Berlin, the situation there was noted with concern.
The effect on people like Albert Speer or Goebbels was considerable. And they thought, what if this is going to happen to us more often now? A firestorm of this magnitude, so many dead. For God's sake, what will the German population do then? Can we then hold out against the war? But not every city was built like Hamburg. You also had to realize that it's relatively hard to kill 40,000 people in a city. It did work in Hamburg. Ultimately, the effect on morale, on the ability to wage war, remained limited.
At least half of Hamburg's apartments were destroyed. A contemporary witness wrote, "From the Wandsbek-Marienthal train station to the main train station, not one house is left. You are now completely homeless because it will take 100 years to rebuild." Those who didn't flee to the countryside had to come to terms with the danger of further attacks. The propaganda invoked the concept of Volksgemeinschaft, in which everyone pitches in. This newsreel from the fall of 1943 shows boys and girls helping to clear up bomb damage.
Viele unserer Jungen und Mädel haben sich in den Luftnotgebieten durch ihren tapferen Einsatz im Herzen des deutschen Volkes einen Ehrenplatz erworben. Eine Abordnung ausgezeichneter Jungen und Mädel Hamburgs in der Reichshauptstadt. Die Besichtigung des Reichssportfeldes führt Ritterkreuzträger Müller, der hier selbst einmal als Rekordläufer vielfache Siege errang. Der Hitlerjunge Werner Kahl, Träger des Kriegsverdienstkreuzes mit Schwertern. Der Hitlerjunge Kurt Pörschke, 12 Jahre alt, der jüngste Träger einer Kriegsauszeichnung, rettete 8 Kinder vor dem Flammentode. Die Mädelführerin Margarete Zettel barg aus einem brennenden Säuglingsheim alle Kinder, bis die Flammen auch ihr Kleid erfasst hatten. Inge Voss rettet in der Angriffsnacht aus völlig zerstörten Häusern 2 Menschen trotz einstürzender Decken. Die tapfersten der Jungen zeichnete der Führer mit dem Eisernen Kreuz 2. Klasse aus. In schwersten Stunden haben sie bewiesen, dass sie sich wie Soldaten zu verhalten wissen.
Since the beginning of their movement, the Nazis had attached special importance to children. After seizing power, they forced their influence on the younger generation.
When they attended kindergarten, they were looked after by teachers who had received National Socialist and ideological training. When they went to school, the only teachers were ones who had a positive attitude toward National Socialism. Their free time was organized by National Socialist organizations. Therefore, both the National Socialist insignia and the Hitler salute were part of their normal everyday life.
The youth organization Hitler Youth was founded as early as the mid-1920s. The National Socialists pursued clear goals.
For the National Socialists, this had a double meaning. First, the National Socialists saw themselves as a form of youth movement. So that means as an organization that mobilized the youth compared to the established parties, to the bureaucracies. And secondly, and this played a central role in the founding of the Hitler Youth, was the access to youth. The possibility of systematic ideologization, uniforming and militarization of those for whom this Third Reich, in its self-image at least, was now competing.
As in all areas of Nazi society, soldiering was glorified in the Hitler Youth. At the Reich Party congresses in Nuremberg, Hitler Youth delegations quickly became a permanent fixture. At the so-called Party Congress of Freedom in September of 1935, Adolf Hitler addressed the young people in attendance and outlined his ideals for the next generation.
In unseren Augen muss der deutsche Junge der Zukunft blank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
Baldur von Schirach, pictured here to the right of Hitler, was supposed to be part of that. The German language and literature student was appointed the first Reich Youth leader by the dictator. In 1940, he was replaced by his previous deputy, Arthur Axmann.
In a way, Baldur von Schirach and Axmann were the prototypes of the youth political functionaries of the Third Reich. They were also well-educated, academically educated functionaries who entered the Nazi movement relatively early on and who shaped the Hitler Youth. And they did so in a very special way, namely, they turned the Hitler Youth, which was initially only a party organization, into a state youth organization. And this process was part of this ideologization of youth in the Third Reich.
Uniforms of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or League of German Girls, and the Hitler Youth soon became part of everyday life in the cities of the Reich, as seen here during a march in Offenburg, Baden. Young people learned to march in step at an early age and were socialized in a military way.
The Hitler Youth was characterized first by the idea of the Führer, by being a leader, by youth leads youth as a guiding principle. Secondly, it was characterized by a concept of loyalty and morality. Loyalty to the Führer and a National Socialist morality linked to very specific conditions, to racism as an essential principle. And thirdly, it meant militarization.
For the regime, young people were first and foremost one thing: military recruits. A film shows the seemingly self-evident development from Hitler Youth to Wehrmacht soldier.
Hier schult die Hitlerjugend den Nachwuchs für die deutsche Marine.
In the youth organization, there were specializations for careers in the army. In the naval Hitler Youth, preparation for a career in the naval forces took place.
Einsteigen zum Kutterrennen. Mit letzter Kraft dem Ziele entgegen.
6 Reichssee sport schools were established in which the next generation was trained. An integral part of the education was also the use of military auxiliary activities.
Rund das Ulmer Münster sammelt Marine-Hitlerjugend mit Eifer Schallplatten für unsere U-Boot-Fahrer. Großadmiral Dönitz, der erfährt, dass die Ulmer Jungen mehr als 3000 Schallplatten für seine U-Boot-Männer gesammelt haben, ladet eine Abordnung in einen U-Boot-Stützpunkt am Atlantik ein. Stolz grüßt die Marine-Hitlerjugend im Atlantik ein erfolgreich heimkehrendes U-Boot und übergibt dann einen Teil der gesammelten 3000 Schallplatten an den Kommandanten.
Contrary to what these pictures suggest, the period of great successes for German submarines by 1943 was over. The cracking of the Enigma code and the increasing air supremacy of the Allies in the North Atlantic put a heavy strain on that military branch. Any encouragement, however small, was welcome.
Ein Maat legt die erste Kostprobe auf. In wenigen Minuten sind die Jungen und die Mannschaft ein Herz und eine Seele. Und nun die Überraschung für die Jungen. Großadmiral Dönitz begrüßt sie mit Reichsjugendführer Axmann auf dem Segelschulschiff Horst Wessel. Mit meinen U-Boot-Fahrern kann man dem Teufel den Bart abscheren, sagt der Großadmiral zu den Jungen. Auf seine Frage, was willst du einmal werden, kommt prompt die Antwort: U-Boot-Fahrer, Herr Großadmiral. Und ihr? Einstimmig: U-Boot-Fahrer, Herr Großadmiral.
National Socialism as a total dictatorship needed the cooperation of all parts of the population, the convinced cooperation. And therefore it was very important to indoctrinate the children in line with the regime, in order to subdue any resistance or criticism of the state. Because it was clear that the system was designed for expansion, that meant that you needed soldiers. You needed a population that was loyal to the regime and willing to carry the ideas of National Socialism out into the world.
In order to realize its dream of a 1,000-year Reich, the regime also needed a future leadership elite. They were to be trained in National Socialist fortresses.
Aus der herben Landschaft der Eifel heraus erstand die Ordensburg Vogelsang. Das gewaltige Mauerwerk der hochstrebenden Türme, die Bauten und Höfe und die monumentalen Plastiken sind Ausdruck eines starken, neuen Geistes.
There were only 3 of these Nazi cadres training centers in the Reich: Vogelsang in the Eifel, Sonthofen in the Allgäu, and Krössensee in Pomerania.
In practice, the students who went there and the curriculum that was taught there was, of course, centrally influenced by the National Socialist world of ideas. and that subjects such as racial studies and things like that were specifically added to the curriculum in order to finish high school. And military training, that is, the physicality of the education, played a central role.
Und also diese Körperlichkeit der Ausbildung eine zentrale Rolle spielt.
According to Robert Ley, head of the German Labor Front, who had created the schools, living tools of the Führer were to be created in these training centers.
Adolf Hitler-Schüler, die während des Krieges auf der Burg erzogen werden, wohnen dem Festakt bei. Der weitaus größte Teil der Ordensjunker steht heute an der Front. Dr. Ley übergibt dem neuen Burgkommandanten die Fahne der Burg.
After their training, many of the kids were among the regime's most fanatical supporters and participated in war crimes in the East. There, the situation for the Wehrmacht deteriorated steadily. After the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, the Red Army launched another offensive on a broad section of the front. Between the Black Sea in the south and Vitebsk in the north, it took place in August of the same year. The increasing Soviet superiority made it difficult for German soldiers not to lose faith in the final victory.
It's actually holding on to hope. You ask yourself, how could they hold out for so long? Although it was actually clear after the Battle of Kursk and after these retreats that this couldn't be done militarily. One wonders, of course, how they were able to go on for so long, how they were able to motivate the soldiers to fight. And you shouldn't underestimate the hope factor. On the one hand, there was always the hope that the Führer was a genius, that the Führer was still going to do it, that the Führer was going to pull something out of the air, some miracle weapon, or that he still had some reserves.
In September, in the central and southern sections of the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht had to withdraw further to the western bank of the Dnieper. The campaign continued to result in enormous losses. On an average day of war, 6 times as many German soldiers died in Russia as in the West.
Above all, it was the loss of personnel that was so painful. There was less and less infantry. As a result, victories were no longer possible. Take 1941, the great victories were largely won by the infantry, less by the tanks. And that was completely missing now, and the East Army was bleeding to death. They were only getting half as many replacements.
In early November, the Red Army liberated Kiev. Since the autumn of 1941, the city, like all of Ukraine, had been under German rule. The appointed Reich Commissar Erich Koch wrote, "The goal of our work must be that the Ukrainians work for Germany. Ukraine has to supply what Germany lacks. This task must be carried out regardless of casualties." In Kiev alone, 150,000 prisoners of war and civilians were murdered. A Red Army dog squadron on its way to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The animals can detect explosives, injured or dead people, and were supposed to help secure the complex after the city was taken. Soviet propaganda units were also filming. Signs of the German occupiers, silent witnesses of the racist policies of domination. Cafes, stores, and theaters were forbidden to Ukrainians and Russians. The attitude of the Germans in the Reich Commissariat is determined by the view that we are dealing with a people who are inferior in every respect. Reich Commissar Koch had noted, by autumn of 1943, the madness about the master race in Kiev was over. A few weeks later, the Red Army achieved a prestigious victory in the northern section of the front. Leningrad had been under siege by the Wehrmacht since September of 1941. A deliberate decision was made not to take the city. Instead, Hitler ordered it to be cut off and then left to its own devices. At least 1 million people died during the blockade. The majority of the victims starved to death.
Leningrad was actually like a magnifying glass for the radicality and totality of this war. Because on the one hand, for the Germans, cities had always been besieged. Since ancient times, there had always been famines in besieged cities. That's nothing new. But the new aspect was to not accept the surrender of a city at all. That was the plan. and also to raze the city to the ground. But it was the same thing on the Soviet side. No matter how many people died, the main thing was to hold Leningrad and to continue to produce weapons and do everything to supply the front line. The conditions were terrible. The party cadres took care of themselves, and it was the ordinary people who had to suffer massively here.
Die Parteikader, die sich versorgen, und die einfache Bevölkerung, die hier massiv zu leiden hat.
In January 1944, the Soviets launched an offensive to finally liberate Leningrad. The attackers met weakened defenders because Army Group North had to face a dramatic situation on other sections of the front and had to give up units. On January 27th, the former Russian capital was liberated. The 18th German Army under Colonel General Lindemann withdrew towards the Baltic states. In the Kremlin, it wasn't just stories of military successes by the Red Army that could be enjoyed in those months. By the autumn of 1943, the Soviets had achieved an important success on the propaganda front just outside Moscow. The focus was on a number of prominent German prisoners of war.
After the victory at Stalingrad, it was clear to the Soviets, especially after the victory at Kursk, that they would win the war. But the big question was, at what cost? The losses were still enormous. And then there arose the consideration, well, what else could we do to somehow end the war faster? Perhaps we can also supply pressure to the Allies, the Western Allies. So they will finally open a second front. Then they had the idea, we still have 22 generals captured in Stalingrad. That would be super if we could use them now to use their indignation at Hitler, their feeling of being betrayed, to threaten with the German opposition government, to threaten the Allies, to say, maybe we can come to an agreement with the Germans, if we already have an opposition government which is even supported by the conservative military.
Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach became president of the BDO. The general of the artillery called for resistance against the Hitler dictatorship.
Fordert den sofortigen Rücktritt Hitlers und seiner Regierung. Kämpft Seite an Seite mit dem Volk, Hitler und sein Regime zu entfernen und Deutschland vor Chaos und Zusammenbruch zu bewahren. Wir würden unsere Pflicht als deutsche Männer verletzen, wenn wir dem für Deutschlands Unglück Schuldigen die Treue halten würden. Es lebe das freie, unabhängige und friedliche Deutschland.
Of course, that appeal was not seen in the German Reich. Here, the propaganda concentrated on its own success stories. A favorite topic remained the development of new weapons to help compensate for the increasing losses of men and material. Adolf Hitler attended a demonstration of the so-called Rail Wolf. The device was designed to render tracks unusable for the enemy, thus limiting their mobility.
Hitler
had a soft spot for this sort of stuff. He was technically approachable and saw himself as an architect. He drew bunker plans and so on. And the great designers knew that, and of course, they also wanted to sell their weapons. So if you could get direct access to Hitler and convince him that you have designed a great weapon, you could then sell him your product bypassing the hierarchy, so to speak. And someone who understood this brilliantly was Werner von Braun.
Werner von Braun worked on the development of new types of rockets at the Army's Research Institute on Usedom. The focus of his research was the development of the liquid-fueled V-2 rocket. After the rocket's reliable flight capability was achieved, it was fitted with 1,000-kilogram explosive devices and renamed Vengeance Weapon 2. By the end of the war, over 3,000 of these V-2s were fired at England, Belgium, and France.
The V-2 was actually a technically very modern device that kicked off the development of the moon rocket. But it was actually wonderful for the Allies that the Germans built it, because it was so incredibly expensive and so incredibly complex. If the Germans had built conventional weapons, airplanes, tanks, could they have done much more things with those? And to what effect? A military effect?
Der militärische Effekt,
a few thousand civilians were killed by them in Antwerp, in London and other cities. But the military effect was, of course, almost zero.
War natürlich fast null.
Meanwhile, Nazi political celebrities never got tired of praising the wonder weapon, V2. By the end of June 1943, Heinrich Himmler saw a demonstration of the rocket in Peenemünde. The test was a sobering experience, and so the SS Reichsführer quickly turned his attention to other topics. A few weeks later, he gave a particularly explosive speech at the town hall in Posen, which had been preserved as an audio document. It is one of the few sources in which a prominent Nazi politician spoke openly about the mass murder of the Jewish population of Europe.
Ich will auch ein ganz schweres Kapitel, will ich hier vor Ihnen in aller Offenheit nennen. Es soll zwischen uns ausgesprochen sein und trotzdem werden wir nicht in der Öffentlichkeit nie darüber reden. Ich meine die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes. Es gehört zu den Dingen, die man leicht ausspricht. Das jüdische Volk wird ausgerottet. Das sagt Ihnen jede Parteigenosse. Ganz klar steht in unserem Programm drin, Ausschaltung der Juden, Ausrottung machen wir, Kleinigkeit. Von euch werden die meisten wissen, was es heißt, wenn 100 Leichen beisammen liegen. Wenn 500 da liegen oder wenn 1000 da liegen. Und dies durchgehalten zu haben und dabei, abgesehen von menschlichen Ausnahmeschwächen, anständig geblieben zu sein, hat uns hart gemacht und ist ein niemals genanntes und niemals zu nennendes Ruhmesblatt.
In the meantime, railroad wagons full of people were rolling from all over Europe to the extermination camps in the east. As part of Operation Reinhardt, which had been launched some 15 months earlier, the National Socialists had, by the fall of 1943, murdered more than 2 million Jews and Roma. Any attempt to resist, such as the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto in the spring of that year, was put down with extreme violence. The inhuman murder machinery of the National Socialists was in full swing. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the World War raged on. After winning the Battle of Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, U.S. troops reached the Gilbert Islands in November. The archipelago was to be captured as part of the so-called Operation Galvanic. To accomplish this, more than 25,000 men of the U.S. Marine Corps were ready. The Gilberts were only an interim target for the American Navy.
Man wollte sich von Insel zu Insel,
they wanted to go from island to island, from the south to get closer to the Japanese mother islands. They wanted to get close enough to the Japanese mother islands so that they could use the Air Force against major Japanese cities and armament factories.
Gegen japanische Großstädte und gegen japanische Rüstungsbetriebe entsenden zu können.
At 5 o'clock in the morning on November 20th, the attack on Tarawa, the main atoll of the Gilberts, started. The fighting troops were accompanied by war correspondents who produced impressive images of the fighting that later formed the basis for the propaganda film With the Marines at Tarawa. The landing GIs met stubborn resistance from the Japanese defenders.
It isn't easy knocking those Japs out of their positions. They're hidden in trees, behind revetments, buried pillboxes, bomb-proofs, bunkers. This bunker is giving us plenty of trouble. We have orders to clean it out. This is what we found on the other side.
Many of the Japanese soldiers would rather die than surrender to the enemy, and so every meter was fought for. Only after days of fighting did the Americans win the battle, but it was an expensive victory.
These are Marine dead. This is the price we have to pay for a war we didn't want. And before it's over, there'll be more dead on other battlefields.
Around 1,000 GIs were killed capturing the atoll, which is only a few square kilometers in size. Countless more bloody battles lay ahead for the U.S. troops before they defeated Hitler's fanatically fighting ally, Japan. Meanwhile, On the European continent, the Third Reich prepared for the Allied landing, which was expected sooner or later on the northern French coast. Troops and material were moved westward on a large scale. In addition, Hitler sent one of his most outstanding generals to the area. Erwin Rommel, who had achieved fame in North Africa as the Desert Fox, took up his command in France at the end of 1943 and reported directly to the Führer.
Rommel arrived in the West at the end of 1943 with orders to improve the defensive position there. And Rommel also succeeded carrying out a large construction program to really strengthen the so-called Atlantic Wall, with bunkers, buildings, with minefields, with the so-called Rommel asparagus logs, against airborne troops.
Zahlreiche Divisionen der deutschen Wehrmacht mit Hunderttausenden von kampferprobten Soldaten stehen an der westlichen Verteidigungsfront Europas bereit. Sie sind mit den modernsten Waffen ausgerüstet. Eine Infanteriekompanie kehrt von der Übung zurück. Scheinwerfer gegen nächtliche Landungsversuche. Generalfeldmarschall Rommel setzt die Besichtigung der Befestigungsanlagen fort.
Rommel was probably chosen because he was one of the most popular German army commanders who for a long time willingly placed himself in the services of Nazi propaganda. Here, the then 52-year-old let himself be filmed addressing his soldiers.
Auf den verfügten Geist unserer Truppe, auf die neue Bewaffnung und die Kampfmittel, die uns in die Hand gegeben sind, können wir den kommenden Ereignissen mit größter Ruhe entgegensehen und brauchen uns keine Sekunde den Kopf zu brechen, gut oder schlecht geht. Es geht bestimmt gut.
Despite isolated progress in fortifying the installations, the unbridgeable Atlantic Wall remained a myth. Thousands of kilometers of coastline could not be protected efficiently. A few months after these photographs were taken, Allied troops would land in Normandy. The Atlantic Wall would not be able to prevent the success of Operation Overlord. Even Rommel couldn't do anything about that. On the day of the landing, he was on home leave. In southern Europe, the Allies were already on the continent by the fall of 1943. Anglo-American troops had been on the Italian mainland since September. Their goal, the conquest of Rome. The Wehrmacht, which had triggered the so-called Axis case and occupied the country after the loss of its Italian ally, withdrew to a defensive line about 100 kilometers south of the Italian capital. At this so-called Gustav Line, the Allied advance initially came to a standstill.
The Wehrmacht lost the ability to attack in 43, and all counterattacks during the Allied landings, such as at Salerno in September 43, failed. But what they could still do was defend, and defensive measures are actually tactically easier to conduct than offensive measures. That's why the Wehrmacht, even with their thinned-out units after all, there were heavy losses, still managed to behave tactically well on the defensive. And they had combat experience. They had been in this war for a long time. And so they managed to hold the front line here for a long time through this combination of factors, including the inexperience of the Allies and the inability of the Allies to adjust tactically to the German way of fighting.
Monte Cassino lies on the Gustav Line, a mountain with an ancient Benedictine abbey on top. From there, access to the valley of the Liris River could be controlled, through which an advance all the way to Rome was easily possible. The Allies were therefore pushing for its capture.
Monte Cassino
is very difficult terrain. It's not that very high, about 500 meters high, but it's a steep terrain, mountainous terrain. You can't operate there very much with tanks and the like. And the Germans were clinging to the mountains with everything they had, with very experienced troops who knew how to fight in mountainous terrain, even in the town of Cassino. They were very experienced troops whose division general used to be a tactics instructor and who knew how to wage war in this terrain.
In January 1944, the battle for the mountain began. Numerous cultural treasures were in the abbey and were also at risk. The German newsreel reported,
diese unersetzlichen Werte vor dem Zugriff der britisch-amerikanischen Kunsträuber zu bewahren, wurden sie von der deutschen Wehrmacht in die Engelsburg in Rom überführt.
So far, the Wehrmacht had been more prominent in this war for the theft of cultural treasures than for their protection.
Ein Vertreter des Vatikan empfängt von einem deutschen Offizier das Verzeichnis der aus dem Kloster geborgenen Stücke.
Historical books, paintings, writings, and building plans found temporary shelter in the former mausoleum of the Roman Emperor Hadrian.
Kostbare handgeschriebene Urkunden werden von deutschen Soldaten in die Engelsburg getragen.
In mid-February, the U.S. Air Force bombed Monte Cassino. The abbey on the mountain was largely destroyed, and at least 250 civilians were killed. As a result, the ruins provided the German units with ideal conditions for defense. A bloody battle broke out that lasted for months.
In this battle, thousands upon thousands of soldiers on both sides died. But both military leaders were, of course, willing to pay that price. Because what would have been the alternative? The Allies would have had to say, okay, we'll agree to a draw. I don't think that would have happened. You had to win the war. And if you then lose a few thousands of people, then that's the way it is. And for the Germans, after all, there was no alternative. Because the question was, if they withdrew, where was a better defensive position?
It was not until mid-May that Allied units succeeded in taking Monte Cassino. More than 50,000 of their soldiers had previously been killed or wounded. The Wehrmacht estimated the losses on the German side at 20,000 men. The road to Rome was clear. On the 4th of June 1944, GIs of the U.S. Fifth Army entered the Italian capital without a fight. Rome had previously been declared a free city, but the war in Italy was far from over. Fierce fighting followed in central and northern Italy that would last until the spring of 1945.